In medieval times, certain tortures were reserved for the unholy. The breast ripper was a device created specifically to target women, to shame them, punish them, and, most terrifying of all, to strip away their very identity. It wasn't just about pain, it was about breaking them as women, as human beings. Imagine a woman, stripped and bound, standing before her accusers. The room is cold, the air thick with the scent of fear and iron. Her hands are bound, her feet held firmly to the ground. But the terror isn't in the crowd or the shame of public humiliation. It's in the device before her, the breast ripper. A metal clamp designed for one singular purpose: to rip the breasts from the chest, tearing flesh from bone with agonizing precision. The breast ripper wasn't a simple tool, it was an instrument of terror. At first glance, it appeared to be a pair of pincers, but this wasn't something you'd use to simply grab or hold. This was a tool made to pierce, to mutilate, to destroy. With sharp claws or pronged ends, the device was specifically made to latch onto a woman's breasts, pierce them, and then tear the flesh away, often removing entire sections of the chest. There were different versions of the tool. Some were designed for immediate destruction, while others allowed for slow, agonizing tearing, pulling skin, muscle, and tissue apart bit by bit. The breast ripper wasn't used for men, it was a weapon reserved for women alone. Women accused of heresy, witchcraft, adultery, or even acting in ways deemed inappropriate by society were the targets. In the Middle Ages, women were often seen as inferior, as instruments of temptation. Their bodies were seen as sites of sin, and tormenting them was thought to purify their souls. The breast ripper wasn't just a tool of pain. It was about public humiliation, about asserting dominance, and about destroying the female identity. The breast ripper wasn't just about mutilation, it was a tool for confession. Women accused of witchcraft were often tortured into confessing, sometimes after hours of physical agony. The mutilation of their breasts was meant to make them confess their sins, their alleged connections to the devil, or their involvement in any crimes. Once the device had torn into her, the woman would be expected to scream, to beg for mercy, and to offer up any confession, even if she were innocent. It was the act of breaking her spirit and forcing a statement, no matter the truth. The damage from the breast ripper wasn't just superficial. It could cause deep, devastating wounds, ripping through muscle, skin, and tissue. In the most brutal instances, the clamps would pierce deep into the chest and tear the breast completely off, leaving jagged wounds and exposing the woman's chest to infection, blood loss, and shock. Women who survived such an ordeal often lived with horrible scars, both physical and mental. The damage to their breasts could leave them disfigured, unable to care for themselves, and often shunned by society, as their bodies were forever marred. In some cases, the breasts would not heal properly, and gangrene or sepsis would set in, leading to further decay or death. The breast ripper wasn't used in private chambers. It was performed in front of crowds, often in public squares or town centers, where spectators could watch the punishment unfold. It was a form of entertainment, a way of ensuring that everyone in town knew what would happen to a woman who dared to defy societal expectations. It was meant to humiliate her, to turn her into an example of what happens when a woman refuses to stay within the bounds of her gendered role. Witch hunts were often the backdrop for the use of the breast ripper. Accusations of witchcraft could stem from anything: a woman's independent nature, her knowledge of healing, or even just strange behaviors that were misunderstood by the superstitious masses. When a woman was accused of being a witch, there were few ways out. The breast ripper was a guaranteed way to break her, to force a confession, whether real or fabricated. Though it's no longer used, the breast ripper serves as a stark reminder of the history of gendered violence and social control. Women, especially in medieval times, were forced to endure a different kind of suffering than men. Their bodies were used as weapons, as tools of punishment, and even as symbols of societal power. The breast ripper symbolizes the extent of that violence, the degree to which women's bodies were controlled, abused, and shamed in the name of justice and punishment. When pain and humiliation combine, there is little left but a broken spirit. The iron spider wasn't just a tool of physical torture, it was designed to strip away the very essence of the victim's humanity. Paired with the breast ripper, it became an instrument of terror reserved for those accused of the gravest sins. Imagine a victim, their body already ravaged by the breast ripper, now faced with something even more horrifying. The iron spider was not merely a device, it was a soul-crushing combination of pain, fear, and mental anguish. Its name says it all, a spider, but made of iron. An executioner's companion to the brutality of medieval torture, a tool designed to keep the victim alive, aware, and broken. Unlike other instruments of torture that may seem crude, the iron spider was a masterpiece of cruel engineering. Its design was as diabolical as the torturers who wielded it. The iron spider wasn't one piece, it was a series of iron legs, sharp and pointed, that could be adjusted and placed in different patterns, spreading out from a central iron body. The victim was forced onto a metal frame, with the sharp claws of the iron spider digging into their skin at varying points across their body, often focusing on sensitive areas, the thighs, the chest, and abdomen. Some versions of the iron spider had legs that curled, digging into the flesh while the victim was bound to it, often helpless, unable to shift or escape. Like the braced ripper, the iron spider was intended specifically for women. Women accused of witchcraft, adultery, or heresy found themselves at the mercy of this device. The purpose of the iron spider was to make the victim feel helpless, to feel trapped within the device, unable to move, unable to escape the sharp points pressing into their flesh. The victim's body was exposed, a vulnerable target, unable to shield themselves from the painful grip of the iron claws. The true horror of the iron spider was not only in the physical agony it caused, but in the mental torment it inflicted. As the iron legs sunk into the victim's flesh, the victim would be forced to remain still, the pressure building with each passing second, with the fear of being pierced more deeply. Every slight shift of weight, every muscle twitch, caused the metal legs to press harder. The victim couldn't even escape the pain by moving away, as every adjustment made the claws dig deeper into the flesh. The victim would become trapped, both physically and psychologically, in a state of unending tension. Much like with the breast ripper, the torturer had control over how long the victim would be subjected to the iron spider's horrors. The torturer could adjust the pressure, making it more painful, or more humiliating depending on the desired effect. Sometimes the victim would be left on the device for hours, enduring both the physical and mental torment as the metal continued to tear into their sensitive areas. In some instances, the legs of the iron spider were heated to further intensify the pain. The combination of heat and pressure often caused severe burns alongside the open wounds, making the suffering even more excruciating. The iron spider was often used after the victim had already suffered the breast ripper, adding another layer of mutilation and pain to an already devastating experience. While the breast ripper targeted the breasts specifically, the iron spider would focus on other sensitive regions, often around the thighs, abdomen, and lower chest. In this sense, the two devices complemented each other. While the breast ripper was designed to destroy the female breast, a symbol of femininity and nurture, the iron spider attacked the vulnerable areas of a woman's body, creating a sense of entrapment. Together, they formed an unbearable combination of physical pain and psychological terror. Survivors of the iron spider often faced permanent disfigurement. The deep puncture wounds, the scarring, and the damage to muscle could leave a woman permanently disabled or disfigured. But the emotional scars were even more devastating. The loss of dignity, the shame, and the mental anguish from being trapped in such a torturous device often left the victim broken, incapable of ever fully recovering. The physical pain might fade, but the emotional toll could last a lifetime. Though the iron spider has long been relegated to the history books, it stands as a symbol of the cruelty that women often faced throughout history. It was a reminder that in medieval times, Women's bodies were seen as public property, subject to brutal punishment for crimes both real and imagined. Much like the breast ripper, the Iron Spider shows us the extent to which gender-based violence was woven into the very fabric of medieval justice. It serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying tortures aren't those that kill quickly, but those that break the spirit, humiliate, and leave scars that can never truly heal. Medieval minds were twisted. Subscribe to see how far they went. It looked harmless at first, like a metal flower still closed. Cold, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. But once it bloomed, it didn't release petals. It tore open flesh. And once it opened inside you, there was no closing it again. Some torture devices were designed to scare, some to humiliate, some to kill. But the Pear of Anguish was different. It was designed to silence. Small, portable, and deceptively delicate, the Pear was a tool of finality. Whether it was used in the mouth, the rectum, or the vagina, it always ended the same way: silence, bleeding, and death. But not instantly. Never instantly. At first glance, it looked ornamental. 4 metal leaves, attached to a central screw mechanism, all tapering toward a blunt point. Some were plain iron, others were ornate, engraved with swirling patterns or symbols of faith. But beauty didn't make it gentle. It made it deceptive. Because when you turned the screw at the base, slowly, deliberately, the 4 segments expanded outward, stretching apart like the blooming petals of a spring flower. Except the Pear wasn't meant to open in sunlight. It was meant to open inside someone. Inside a heretic's mouth. Inside a woman's body. Inside a prisoner's rectum. Each variant of the Pear was sized for a particular orifice, and it was inserted closed, compact, slick with oil, sometimes even heated beforehand. And then it was turned. Not fast. Never fast. The more it opened, the more it tore. And there was no safe limit. No halfway. The further the screw turned, the wider it split. And the wider it split, the more irreversible the damage became. Historians are divided on its exact origins, but most agree it first appeared in early 17th century Europe, specifically in France, Italy, and Spain, often connected to inquisitorial courts or civil torture chambers. Its official name varied depending on location. Pear of Anguish, choke pear, pear of confession, but its purpose remained consistent: to punish through mutilation, not necessarily death, at least not immediately. The church rarely used it directly, but inquisitors, secular enforcers, and executioners did, and the targets, women accused of witchcraft or sexual deviance, homosexuals or sodomites, priests or monks caught in scandal, people who spoke blasphemy in public. The Pear was seen as fitting, symbolic, a violation for a violation, a punishment delivered inside the body for sins supposedly committed in secret. The cruel irony was intentional. Perhaps the most infamous variant was the oral Pear, used to silence blasphemers, liars, and dissenters. The Pear was forced into the victim's mouth between clenched teeth and then slowly expanded, jaws cracked, teeth shattered, tongues ruptured, throats torn. In many cases, the screw was turned until the jaw completely dislocated or snapped, leaving the victim unable to speak or even eat ever again. One recorded use in 1621 Paris involved a man named Jean-Michel de Rennes, accused of mocking a bishop during Mass. He was arrested without trial, dragged to a cellar chamber beneath a monastery, and fitted with the Pear. It was inserted dry, no oil, no preparation. They say he bit down so hard in protest that 3 of his own teeth shattered on impact. They expanded the device anyway. His jaw broke in 2 places. His soft palate tore open. And according to one witness, his final gurgled scream sounded like drowning bird. He died 2 days later of infection. No funeral. The vaginal and rectal Pears. These were considered the most unholy variants and were used most frequently against women accused of consorting with the devil, men accused of sodomy, victims of political revenge. There was no attempt at sterility, no anesthesia, just the cold of stone walls, iron restraints, and the turning of a screw. In women, the Pear was often inserted while she was bound face up on a wooden slab, sometimes heated, sometimes not. As it expanded, it tore the vaginal canal, ruptured tissue, and in the worst cases, punctured the uterus or bladder. In men, rectal piers were considered a double punishment. Not just humiliation, but internal destruction. The rectum, the colon, tissues not built to stretch in that direction, were shredded slowly from within. In both cases, survival was rare, and if they did survive, they lived with permanent internal damage, incontinence, or sterility. It was punishment and erasure, the body marked forever, in the Vatican's Shadow Archive. Accessible only to a handful of scholars, there's a transcribed confession from a woman arrested in Avignon, 1614. Her name was Agnes La Rose, aged 34, accused of hosting moonlit rituals of feminine impurity. In other words, she was seen bathing in the river with other women. Laughing, the record says, she was taken at dawn, refused to name others, was presented with the pier, still refused. After insertion, she bit her tongue off in protest and choked on it. Death followed swiftly. They kept the pier, cleaned it, and used it again the next week. Some skeptics claim the Pear of Anguish was symbolic, that it was never truly used, that most surviving examples are too delicate or ornate for real torture, but those arguments miss the point. Torture in medieval and early modern Europe wasn't always about mass use. Sometimes the threat was more powerful than the act. And the pier, its image alone, was terrifying enough, but multiple records from Spain, France, and Eastern Europe describe victims with injuries that align perfectly with what the pier could do. Crushed jaws, torn internal canals, death without visible wounds. So yes, it was real, rare perhaps, but real. And most importantly, it worked. Not as truth-finding, but as control. What made the pier uniquely awful wasn't just what it did to the body. It was what it did to the soul. It wasn't loud. There was no hammer, no blade, no screaming from a whip or branding iron. Just a slow, grinding twist. A subtle widening. And the victim's breath catching on their own blood. There's a reason people feared speaking out in that era. Why they whispered instead of shouted. Why they crossed themselves before uttering certain words. Because the pier was always waiting. Not in a courtroom, not in a jail cell, but in a drawer, in a box, in a priest's robes, in the pocket of a nobleman's steward. You never knew if you'd see one, but you always feared it. Let the next horror find you. Subscribe now. There are tools that kill. There are tools that maim. And then there are tools that were made for a single monstrous act. The crocodile shears weren't weapons. They were a ritual, a message, a sentence written in blood, meant only for kings, rebels, and traitors. The name sounds almost ridiculous, like something from a cartoon. But the crocodile shears were not a joke. They were real. They were used. And they were designed for one thing only, mutilating male royalty in the most horrific, symbolic way imaginable. No accidental deaths, no improvisation, no variety in purpose. This wasn't a torture device that could be used on arms or legs. It wasn't meant for general punishment. The crocodile shears had only one target: the penis of a man accused of betrayal. The tool itself was forged from iron or steel, shaped like a pair of oversized shears or pincers. It looked like a large pair of tongs, but with one grotesque twist. The inside of the pincers were lined with spikes. Not flat, not smooth razored, sharpened and jagged. Some were toothed like a crocodile's mouth, hence the name. Others were barbed, designed to rip flesh during removal, not just entry. It was said that the teeth interlocked, ensuring no flesh could slide out once clamped. Once it bit down, there was no undoing it cleanly. Some designs were heated until glowing red, turning the act into one of cauterized horror. Others were left cold, so the victim could feel everything as nerves were crushed and torn. This was never used on peasants. The crocodile shears were ceremonial in their way, used primarily for royal punishments, that meant. Princes accused of treason, rulers deposed by rivals, clergy accused of sacrilege or sedition, knights turned conspirators. When a man was sentenced to the crocodile shears, the message was clear. You've defied the crown. You've betrayed your blood. And now we will make sure you leave none behind. It was a brutal symbolic execution, not just about pain, but about erasing a man's legacy, lineage, and dignity. The condemned would be stripped naked, often bound by wrists and ankles, sometimes forced to stand, sometimes hung by the wrists, feet dangling. The humiliation was always public, always surrounded by jeering crowds, guards, and occasionally priests. The shears were then heated in a fire glowing red hot and held aloft for all to see. The torturer, usually a state executioner or black-robed cleric, would step forward. He would grab the penis, sometimes with tongues, sometimes bare-handed, and place it into the open maw of the shears. The shears would then be clamped shut. What happened next depended on the intent. Sometimes they were twisted, causing the spikes to grind through the flesh. Sometimes they were yanked away suddenly, tearing everything out in one horrifying rip. And sometimes they were left clamped, the man bleeding out slowly, screaming into the dirt. Death didn't always come fast. If the blood loss didn't kill them, infection would. Or the torture would continue, with beatings, branding, or dismemberment following. One of the few recorded uses of the crocodile shears comes from 15th century Germany, though stories of their use spread through France, England, and even parts of Italy. According to a Bavarian account, a prince accused of plotting against the archbishopric was taken to the town square. His manhood was torn from him with the jaws of the devil's shears. He lived for 2 days, shrieking prayers and curses alike. Another rumored case in England involved a noble whose lineage threatened a king's claim to the throne. Rather than execute him publicly, they chose the crocodile shears so that he would never produce an heir and the royal bloodline would end with him. The act was witnessed by only a handful of nobles, but the story spread like wildfire, seeding fear in every noble house nearby. There's something different about this kind of mutilation. Cut off a hand, and a man can still fight. Take an eye, and he can still see. Break bones, and they can heal. But remove his manhood, and in the medieval mind, you remove his power, his future, his soul. The crocodile shears weren't just pain. They were legacy killers. And that made them more feared than fire, more feared than the rack, even more than death. Torture has always evolved. The more politics replaced brute power, the more symbolic punishments like this fell away. Eventually, decapitation became the standard for royal executions. Quicker, cleaner, more civilized. The crocodile shears became a legend, whispered about in courtrooms and castles. Often denied, sometimes mocked, but always remembered. It's said that one pair still exists, rusted and warped, kept in a private collection somewhere in Eastern Europe. Never confirmed. Never displayed. And if they do exist, they are likely still stained with something black, a mix of blood and soot that never fully came off. What if you were punished not for what you did, but for what you believed? The Heretic's fork was designed for one cruel purpose: to punish those whose thoughts strayed from the script. A torture device that didn't just pierce flesh, it policed the soul. In the vast theater of medieval cruelty, some tools were made to silence screams. Others, to prevent speech altogether. The Heretic's fork was never meant to kill you. It wasn't designed to tear you limb from limb. It didn't bleed you dry. Instead, it immobilized your truth, locked your voice, and trapped you in agony for days. A tool as simple as a rod, as brutal as silence, and as terrifying as the thought that your own words, your own prayers, could be the thing that damned you. To understand the Heretic's fork, you have to understand the era it thrived in, the Spanish Inquisition, the Roman Catholic Church's war on heresy, and a time when belief was more dangerous than murder. During these centuries, the church wasn't just a place of worship, it was law, order, and judge. And to believe something different, even quietly, was to risk everything. The fork was part of a toolkit of psychological and physical punishments meant to crush heresy, blasphemy, and doubt. This wasn't about confession. This was about control. The Heretic's fork was deceptively simple in design. It consisted of a metal rod, about 30 to 40 centimeters in length. At both ends were sharp, two-pronged forks. Not like eating utensils, but more like short, cruel spikes spaced just far enough apart to avoid piercing through, but close enough to inflict unbearable pain. Here's how it worked. One end of the fork was pressed upward, just under the chin, stabbing into the soft flesh. The other end was pressed downward, into the sternum or upper chest, or sometimes even into the throat or collarbone. The device was then strapped in place, using leather cords or iron clasps around the neck and torso. The result: the victim could not lower their head. They couldn't speak, cry out, or move their jaw without feeling the twin prongs dig deeper. And worse, any attempt to fall asleep or faint would result in the same. The head would droop, and the forks would pierce further into flesh. Sleep became impossible. And that was the point. You didn't die from the heretic's fork. But over hours, then days, the damage became profound. Sleep deprivation set in, causing hallucinations, nervous tremors, and eventually madness. Jaw and neck muscles cramped and failed, creating excruciating tension, headaches. Infection sometimes followed, especially if the prongs pierced deeply enough. But the real killer was the mind, denied rest, denied speech, denied escape. Some victims were left in this state for 2, 3, even 4 days, often bound to a wall or stake, forced to stand or kneel, slowly succumbing to delirium. Who got the fork? Not thieves, not murderers, not witches, but those who believed differently. A man who said the soul did not require confession. A woman who prayed in Latin when the local dialect was enforced. A priest who doubted transubstantiation. A scholar who whispered that the earth moved. Each of them could be brought before an inquisitor, interrogated, judged, and sentenced to silence by iron. The heretic's fork was never about getting a confession. It was about forcing you to live inside your own head in agony, with no escape and no one left who could hear you. Some versions of the fork bore engravings. One of the most infamous read, Aburo, I recant. Others said, Sic tessit, thus he is silent. And some even bore the symbols of the Inquisition itself, crossed keys, or a burning torch, branding the tool with its righteous purpose. These weren't just instruments of pain. They were ritual objects meant to make the act of suffering sacred, to turn silence into submission. Some did survive the fork. They were released, often after making a public recantation of their beliefs. But they were marked forever by scars under the chin, by speech issues, by tremors or tics that would last the rest of their lives. Others were not so lucky. They'd be taken down from the fork, weak, shaking, barely conscious, and immediately burned at the stake or broken on the wheel. The fork wasn't the end. It was the prelude, a test of loyalty, and if you failed it. The church had worse waiting. It wasn't meant to kill you quickly. The breaking wheel was a performance, a slow-motion execution, drawn out for hours, sometimes days. It wasn't just about death. It was about spectacle, humiliation, and the art of suffering. To die on the breaking wheel was to become a warning in motion. Your limbs weren't simply broken. They were displayed, contorted, snapped, stretched across spokes like grotesque symbols of pain perfected. Known across Europe by many names, the Catherine wheel, rad, raid, or simply the wheel. This device was the crown jewel of public punishment. It wasn't always about guilt. Sometimes it was about reminding the crowd who held the power. And if you were unlucky enough to be chosen, your death would be a lesson in anatomy and cruelty. At first glance, it looked like a common wooden cartwheel, roughly 4 to 6 feet in diameter, reinforced with iron rims, mounted either vertically like a standing crucifix or horizontally like a spinning table of doom. But it wasn't used for transportation. It was used to turn a body into a broken map of pain. Victims would be stripped naked for humiliation, tied or nailed to the spokes, arms and legs spread wide, or laid flat on a raised platform with the wheel used as a blunt weapon. What followed wasn't quick. It was orchestrated. It was methodical. It was designed to be watched. Executioners were often trained in a specific order of destruction. They knew how to break bones without killing you too fast. The shin was usually first, then the thigh, then the forearms, upper arms, and shoulders. Joints were shattered. Bones were splintered through with iron bars, heavy mallets, or hammers. In some variants, iron studs lined the wheel itself, crushing flesh as it rolled over the body. The goal: to break every long bone in the body while keeping the torso intact, preserving life for as long as possible. The victim couldn't flee. They couldn't fight. They could only feel. In some cases, the victim would be woven through the wheel, limbs threaded in and out of the spokes like a grotesque tapestry. Then the wheel would be hoisted vertically on a stake, displayed for all to see. Crows, dogs, and flies would feast on the wounds. Children would point. Priests would pray. And still, the victim might live. Some accounts say prisoners survived 2 or 3 days, left out under the sun and stars, begging to die, their breath shallow, their bones pulverized, their bodies twisted into shapes that defied mercy. Not every thief got the wheel. It was saved for the worst of the worst, or those the authorities wanted to make an example of: murderers, robbers who killed their victims, rapists, blasphemers, and sometimes political rebels. But often, the sentence had more to do with public anger than actual justice. If the people needed a villain, the wheel was summoned. It didn't matter if you were guilty, only that your death would be memorable. There was a supposed mercy, the coup de grace, the blow of grace. A well-aimed final strike to the chest or neck, designed to end the suffering quickly. Some executioners offered it, others delayed it, and a few, under orders or for show, withheld it altogether, letting the condemned endure the full sentence. Imagine lying twisted in a wooden halo, legs bending the wrong way, blood soaking into oak, while the village cheered, or simply watched in silence. You wouldn't be remembered as a person. You'd be remembered as a lesson. Ironically, the breaking wheel is also known as the Catherine Wheel, named after Saint Catherine of Alexandria, a martyr who was supposed to be executed on the wheel. Legend says the wheel shattered at her touch, miraculously sparing her from torture, though she was later beheaded. Still, the name stuck. A holy relic wrapped in blood and bone. Even more ironic, the Catherine Wheel lives on today as a firework, a spinning spark of light, a child's wonder. Unknowing tribute to a tool of incomprehensible pain. There are tortures meant to kill you. And then, there are tortures meant to make you talk. The head crusher was for the latter, when silence wasn't an option, and confession wasn't a choice. This device didn't just destroy your skull. It forced you to admit to anything, even if you hadn't done it. You can almost hear the turning of the screw. One click, another, and another. Each twist was deliberate. Each twist was a threat. Each twist brought your skull closer to collapse. The head crusher wasn't flashy. It wasn't messy. It didn't draw rivers of blood like the breaking wheel or the iron chair, but it was precise. It was calculated. And worst of all, it was quiet. The only sound was your own jaw grinding, your teeth splintering, and the low creak of steel pressing into bone. The device looked simple enough. Just a metal cap, a lower brace, and a long screw handle at the top. The prisoner's chin was placed on the lower bar, the skull pressed beneath the upper cap. Then the executioner began to tighten the screw. Each turn lowered the top plate, compressing the skull like a vise. First, the teeth would shatter, then the jawbone snapped, the cheekbones fractured next, the eyes bulged from their sockets. And still, you could be alive, still conscious, still able to speak. That was the point. Unlike other devices meant to kill, the head crusher was a tool of interrogation. Used widely during the Spanish Inquisition and medieval Europe, it was often the first step in extracting a confession. You were told what you were accused of. You were asked if it was true. If you said no, the screw turned once. If you hesitated, it turned again. You didn't need to be guilty. You just needed to bleed from the mouth, twitch in pain, and beg it to stop. That was all they needed. A scream, a word, a yes, confession complete. And if you were lucky, they'd stop there. If not, they kept turning. Medieval law had a strange relationship with torture. Confession was the king of evidence. If you said it aloud, it was treated as fact, even if it was a lie screamed through broken teeth. So torture wasn't just about cruelty, it was legal strategy. The head crusher was a favorite because it left no blood, No open wounds, and, if stopped in time, no death. You could be tortured on Monday and sentenced on Tuesday, and no one would question the outcome. They had your words, and the head crusher made sure you gave them. Of course, sometimes they didn't stop. Sometimes the goal wasn't confession. It was punishment, or intimidation, or entertainment, so the screw would turn past the breaking point. Your orbital bones would implode. The sockets collapsed inward. Blood would leak from the ears, and eventually, the skull would crack like a rotten gourd, one single snap, and silence. There wasn't much left to bury. Just pulp, bone dust, and a machine still warm from the pressure. The head crusher wasn't the only tool of its kind. There were face vises, mouth openers, jaw compressors, all designed with one thing in mind: make you talk, or make you die trying. In Italy, they used a mask of agony with embedded spikes. In France, iron muzzles clamped the mouth shut, causing suffocation mid-scream. In Germany, the head crusher was refined with extra screws for precise pressure on the temples and nasal bridge. Each culture had its own way of turning the skull into a confession box. It's impossible to know how many confessions were truthful. Probably very few, because under that kind of pressure, under that kind of agony, people said anything. That they worshipped demons, that they cast spells on livestock, that they met with witches under the full moon, that they cursed the king's wine, that they danced with the devil himself. They said whatever it took to make the screwing stop. And that's all the torturer wanted. Some tortures weren't about force. They were about suspension, a delicate balance between pain, fear, and flesh. The Judas Cradle was one of the most humiliating and agonizing instruments ever conceived. It wasn't just about being pinned. It was about being suspended in agony. Imagine being bound and hoisted into the air, only you're not hanging freely. You're sitting not on a chair, but on a sharpened, triangular spike. This is the Judas Cradle, a device that combines torture with intense psychological terror. Your body suspended in midair, impaled on a point that rips through your most delicate areas. It wasn't designed to kill quickly. It was designed to wear you down, break you mentally, and make you confess no matter the cost. The Judas Cradle looked deceptively simple. It was just a wooden seat, but this seat had a very specific feature. A sharp, pyramid-shaped spike rising from it. This wasn't an ordinary chair. This wasn't even a seat. The victim was stripped naked, tied by ropes, and lowered onto the device, the point aiming directly at the anus or genital area, depending on the position. Once seated, or more accurately suspended, the point of the pyramid would tear into the flesh. The longer the victim was left hanging, the deeper the impalement would become. There was no room for comfort, no room for escape. And there was no safe position. You couldn't even rest. The spike would dig deeper if you tried to shift. The victim wasn't sitting on the spike. They were suspended above it, with most of their weight pulling downward. But the sharp point forced them to remain seated on it, applying pressure to the body, often causing the anus, vagina, or anus to tear with every shift of movement. This was designed not just to hurt. It was meant to make the body shudder with each agonizing wave of pain. The Judas Cradle didn't just hurt the body. It tormented the mind. The victim would slowly rock, suspended by the ropes, the weight pressing on the body while the sharp point sliced deeper. The fear of falling, of losing control, would only make the experience more excruciating. Every second felt like eternity. The mind, caught between terror and pain, would begin to unravel. And worse still, sometimes the device wasn't even used in the immediate aftermath of a crime. It was often applied to enemies of the state, heretics, or political prisoners. The Judas Cradle didn't just humiliate, it terrified the victim, and it forced them to confess, to scream out whatever the torturer wanted to hear, just to end the nightmare. The torture could last for hours or days, depending on the intentions of the torturers. Some victims were kept alive for days, their bodies slowly consumed by infection from the deep tissue wounds caused by the spike. Others succumbed to shock or bleeding, or were eventually pulled off the spike just before death to force a final confession. But more often than not, the psychological toll of prolonged suspension did as much damage as the physical. The fear of further pain, or of not being able to endure the weight of pain, pushed the victim to break faster. The Judas Cradle's purpose wasn't always death, it was confession. Once the victim was sitting for enough time, they were expected to spill their secrets. Who were you working for? What plots were you part of? Who else was involved? It didn't matter if you were guilty. It didn't matter if your name had been wrongfully slandered. If you stayed on the Judas Cradle long enough, you'd start believing you were guilty too. The pain would blur the line between truth and lie. The device didn't care. Like many medieval devices, the Judas Cradle had variations across different regions. In Spain, the device was known as the Silla de los Reyes. In Italy, it was sometimes used alongside other devices like the strappado, where the victim's arms were tied behind their back and pulled upwards, stretching the body. Some versions of the Judas Cradle were height adjustable, allowing the torturer to slowly increase the distance from the victim's weight to the spike, forcing them to sink deeper into the point. In some instances, it was combined with other forms of torment, burning, flaying, or dismemberment. The ultimate goal, however, was still the same: to crush the spirit. When the victim was finally removed from the device, their flesh was often torn, their nerves damaged, and their body completely deformed. In some cases, death was inevitable, but not always from the device itself. The shock, blood loss, and sepsis from impaled tissues were the usual causes of death. And as with all the worst medieval tortures, no one left the Judas Cradle with their dignity intact. They were broken, humiliated, and often forgotten. Imagine the unbearable sensation of drowning, but with no escape. This is water torture, a medieval method that tortured its victims by drowning them, slowly, controlled, and mercilessly within the cold, oppressive walls of stone cells. Picture the scene. You are locked in a dark stone cell, the air thick with dampness. There is a single source of light, flickering weakly from a small crack above, casting eerie shadows across the walls. You can hear the dripping sound of water, slow, steady, deliberate. You are not alone. The walls of your cell close in, and the very air seems to press against your chest, thick with the foreboding sensation of suffocation. But this is no accident. This is water torture. Water torture was a cruel form of medieval controlled drowning used to extract confessions, punish supposed criminals, or simply inflict psychological terror. It wasn't about drowning a person outright. It was about prolonging the agony and inducing the constant fear of death, all while keeping them barely alive. Victims were placed in stone cells, their bodies subjected to water slowly filling the room, or, in other variations, poured onto their faces, forcing them to experience drowning in small, grueling doses. The stone cells were often small, confined spaces, where the victim had little room to move or escape. These cells were cold, damp, and often designed with no ventilation, increasing the sense of suffocation and helplessness. In some variations, the victim would be submerged up to the chest in cold, stagnant water, slowly rising to the neck over time, leaving them unable to move. The stone walls would be a constant reminder of their immobility, trapped in a tomb of despair. With no escape and the water rising, the victim's mind would begin to fracture under the pressure. Water torture didn't just involve drowning the victim instantly, it was about creating a slow, agonizing descent into panic and fear. The water would begin at the feet, and over time inch its way upwards, reaching the knees, the waist, the chest, and eventually the neck. At every stage, the victim would experience the horrible sensation of drowning, the overwhelming urge to breathe, but with no way to get air. The mind would race, and the body would fight, but the water would slowly fill every available space, keeping the victim just on the brink of drowning, without ever actually letting them slip away into death. Every second was a test of endurance, pushing the victim's body and mind to their limits. One of the most terrifying aspects of water torture was not just the pain or the physical discomfort, it was the mental anguish of knowing that the end was coming. The slow rise of water would cause panic to set in. Victims often couldn't move, couldn't escape the rising tide. Each breath felt like the last. The body's fight or flight response kicked into overdrive. The victim knew that it was only a matter of time before the water would reach their mouth, then their nose, and then they would drown. But the torture was often prolonged by shifting amounts of water or manipulating the timing of the floods, keeping the victim in a constant state of terror. Just when they thought it was over, the water would start again. In some variations of the water torture, the victim's head would be bound or restrained, unable to lift or turn. They were subjected to water poured onto their face or forced to drink water as a form of torture. The water would be cold, adding an element of shock to the experience. Cold water would also trigger a body's fight or flight response, sending the victim into a state of hyperventilation and shocking their system. The sensation of breathing in water would only worsen their feeling of drowning. Even as they weren't yet submerged, the water was no longer just submerged around them, it was poured directly onto them, filling their lungs and overwhelming their nervous system, keeping them on the verge of suffocation. If the victim survived such torture, the long-term effects could be devastating. The psychological scars would run deep. The victim would be haunted by the memory of drowning, by the sense of being trapped, of struggling to breathe, and the unavoidable sense of fear. Physically, the body would endure significant trauma. The lungs could be damaged from forced drowning, and the body could suffer from severe hypothermia if the water was cold enough. The constant exposure to water meant that victims would often experience chronic illnesses, such as pneumonia, respiratory infections, or even long-term damage to the brain due to the lack of oxygen during such prolonged sessions of near drowning. Water torture was used for a number of purposes in medieval justice, primarily to extract confessions from suspected witches, heretics, and anyone accused of crimes against the state or church. It was effective not just because of its brutality, but because it capitalized on a universal fear: the fear of drowning, the loss of breath, and the inability to control one's body. As with other medieval tortures, the ultimate goal was to break the spirit, forcing the victim to confess or give in to the torturer's will. Water torture didn't simply make the body suffer, it made the mind suffer, too. Water torture is now a horrible relic of the past, but its legacy lives on in the way we understand the use of fear and control in torture. Today, it serves as a reminder of the depths of human cruelty, the lengths people went to in order to extract confessions or maintain power over others. Water torture stands as a testament to just how far humans will go to instill fear, and to use that fear to break others. Imagine your leg being crushed under an unyielding force, the bones slowly grinding together. This is the agony of the boot, a cruel medieval device designed to break bones with surgical precision, leaving victims alive only to suffer endless pain. In the dim light of a cold stone chamber, the only sound that breaks the silence is the creaking of metal and the soft whimpers of someone in excruciating pain. The victim is placed in a wooden frame, bound tightly, unable to move. They are forced into a position of utter helplessness, a grim anticipation settling into their bones. But this is no simple punishment. This is the boot. The boot, often referred to by the medieval executioners as a device for breaking bones, was a precise and excruciating instrument of torture designed to inflict immense pain without necessarily causing instant death. The victim would be strapped down to a frame with their legs exposed. A metal boot would be placed over the foot and lower leg, and then a series of screws or wedges would begin tightening. As the screws dug into the soft flesh of the legs, the victim would feel their bones starting to crack under pressure. But the worst was yet to come. Unlike simple crushing, the boot was designed to break the bones with calculated precision. It wasn't just about pressure, it was about the systematic cracking of bones, sometimes starting with the toes, then working upward, breaking the ankle, the shin, and eventually even splintering the femur if the torture continued long enough. Victims would experience their bones being snapped under the weight of the device, each fracture a new wave of agony that could make the strongest man beg for mercy. The device's precision meant that no bone was spared. The bones of the feet, often some of the smallest and most fragile, would break first, sending unbearable pain through the victim's entire body. This pain would then radiate up the leg as the boot's mechanism continued to apply pressure. While the physical pain of the boot was excruciating, it also inflicted severe psychological trauma. The victim would know that no one was coming to help. They were trapped in a slow, agonizing process where each moment felt like an eternity. The process could take hours, depending on the severity of the torture and the victim's endurance. For some, the feeling of helplessness and isolation was as devastating as the physical suffering. The victim would often be kept fully conscious, enduring each crack and snap of their bones as they screamed in agony, with no way to escape the device's grasp. So why was such a horrible device used in medieval times? The boot was used for a variety of purposes, most commonly as a tool for extraction of confessions or punishment for those accused of crimes against the state or the church. Many accused of heresy, treason, or other political offenses were subjected to the boot to break their will as much as their bones. But the boot wasn't limited to mere punishment. It was a form of control, designed to break the spirit of the victim in addition to their body. The slow, agonizing nature of the torture often led to the victim confessing or admitting to crimes, whether true or not, just to end the unbearable pain. Surviving the boot was a rare and horrific outcome. Even if the victim was spared death, the long-term effects were devastating. The broken bones would heal improperly, leaving the victim with crippling deformities. Victims would often suffer from chronic pain for the rest of their lives, with their legs often becoming deformed and non-functional. The psychological scars of enduring such a traumatic experience would often haunt them for the rest of their days. The boot was eventually phased out, replaced by less precise, though still cruel, forms of execution and punishment. However, it serves as a stark reminder of the inhumanity of medieval justice, where torture wasn't just a way to extract confessions, but a way to inflict control, pain, and suffering on those who were deemed undesirable by the powers that be. The victim's bones would be broken, their spirit crushed, and their humanity discarded, all for the sake of enforcing power through pain. For those who endured the boot, it was not just the fear of death that haunted them, but the fear of being broken, of having their body reduced to something less than human. The boot was a device designed to turn a person into something subjugated, and its legacy remains a reminder of the depths of human cruelty. Imagine your limbs being stretched beyond their limits, your joints being pulled in opposing directions, until you can feel the very fibers of your body tearing apart. This is the agony of the rack, a medieval device designed to extract secrets by stretching a victim's body and mind to the breaking point. The chamber is dark, except for the dim flickering of a torch mounted on the stone wall. The air is thick with the stench of sweat, fear, and damp stone. You are restrained, your body helpless, lying flat on a cold wooden plank. Around you, the sound of clanking chains and the whine of pulleys fills the room. The echoes seem to resonate deep within your chest, making it impossible to ignore the coming terror. You can hear your own heartbeat, as if it were amplified in the silence, but there is no escape. The executioner moves toward you, a grim, cold gaze in his eyes. His hands reach for the device beside you, the rack. The rack was one of the most infamous torture devices used throughout medieval and early modern Europe. It consisted of a wooden frame with 4 pulleys or ropes attached to each limb. The victim was bound to the device with their hands and feet attached to the ropes. The device worked by stretching the victim's body, causing excruciating pain as the limbs were slowly pulled in opposite directions. The bones would dislocate, the muscles would tear, and the joints would suffer the unbearable strain of being stretched beyond their natural limits. The primary use of the rack was to extract confessions from prisoners accused of crimes, especially political ones. It was often used on accused heretics, spies, or those suspected of treason as a means of forcing them to speak. Unlike immediate physical punishment like beheading or hanging, the rack was a slow, methodical form of torture designed to wear down the victim's will and force them to confess. The agonizing pain and constant stretching would often break the victim's resolve, leading them to reveal secrets, whether they were guilty or not. It was a mental game as much as it was a physical one. The victim would be forced to choose between suffering and revealing whatever the torturer wanted to hear. The process of torture was agonizingly slow. Once strapped onto the rack, the victim's limbs were tightly bound, and the pulleys began to turn, slowly stretching the body. The victim's arms and legs would be pulled, and the body would be slowly extended at a pace that felt eternal. The limbs would be forced further apart, and the body would experience intense pressure as the spine was elongated. As the bones and joints began to stretch, ligaments would snap, muscles would tear, and dislocations would occur. The victim's spine was at the center of the torment. It was the backbone, quite literally, of the suffering, a slow, creeping agony that felt like being pulled apart from the inside out. For the victim, each second spent on the rack was an eternity. As the body was stretched, the bones would begin to dislocate. Should the torture continue, joints in the arms, legs, shoulders, and hips would separate. The spine itself was at the highest risk of fracturing, sometimes causing permanent nerve damage or paralysis. One of the most horrific results of being stretched on the rack was the complete disruption of the victim's skeletal structure. Their bones would be fractured, their muscles and ligaments torn, and their spine could break under the intense pressure. The constant pulling caused bruising, internal bleeding, and nerve damage, leaving the victim with lifelong pain or even death if the torture continued for too long. But it wasn't just the physical pain that made the rack so effective. It was the mental torture. Victims were often kept in extreme states of fear before the torture began. They knew what was coming. They had seen or heard about the fates of others who had suffered the same fate. The psychological effects of being strapped onto the rack were overwhelming. The victim's mind would be riddled with fear, knowing that their bones were being stretched, pulled apart. The anticipation of the pain, combined with the actual suffering, would often break the will before the body even fully gave way. Many victims would beg for death or promise anything just to escape the torturous stretching. In some cases, victims would die before confessing, with their bodies torn apart beyond recognition. The use of the rack was widespread during the medieval period, especially in courtrooms and dungeons controlled by the church or the state. The Inquisition made frequent use of the device to force accused heretics or witches to confess to crimes, whether they were true or fabricated. For the inquisitors, it was about control, forcing their subjects to give in and speak, to bend the body and mind to their will. The rack was an expression of power, showing the ability to turn a person into a mere object of pain, one that could be stretched and manipulated to fit the torturer's needs. Though the rack fell out of favor as a tool of torture, it remains a grim symbol of the medieval world's obsession with control through pain. In the end, the rack was not simply a torture of the body, it was a test of endurance for the mind and soul. The victim's very humanity was stretched to its breaking point, the body twisted and pulled, until the person was nothing but a shadow of their former self, drained of strength and will. A device that could fit in the palm of your hand, yet caused some of the most intense and excruciating pain a person could endure. Thumbscrews, seemingly small, but the agony they delivered was enough to make even the strongest soul beg for mercy. The room is dimly lit by a single flickering candle. You can hear the sound of clinking metal as the executioner approaches, his presence growing closer with each step. The air is thick with the smell of fear and anxiety, the kind of tension that only a torture chamber can produce. You are bound, your hands trembling, your palms sweating, your heart racing. In front of you, a small, unassuming tool lies on the table. It looks almost harmless at first glance, just a pair of metal contraptions, a set of screws, and a bar. But as the executioner picks them up, you know that what comes next will be nothing short of agony. Thumbscrews, often referred to as a cruel hand torture device, were deceptively simple in design, but their pain was anything but simple. The device itself consisted of two metal bands, each with a screw mechanism. The victim's thumb would be placed inside the bands, which would then be slowly tightened. As the screw turned, the metal bands would gradually close around the thumb, squeezing the flesh and bones together. The pressure built up slowly at first, but with each turn of the screw, the pain would intensify until it became unbearable. The process was methodical, and it was designed to maximize pain over time. Thumbscrews were often used by inquisitors to force confessions or punish criminals for offenses. It wasn't just the pressure of the screw that caused agony, it was the pain of crushing and the damage to the nerves and bones in the thumb. At first, the victim would experience a feeling of discomfort as the device tightened around their thumb. But as the pressure increased, the pain would escalate to a point where it felt like the bones themselves were being shattered. The nerves would sever, and the victim would be left with a feeling of intense burning and numbness as the thumb was crushed. What made thumbscrews particularly cruel wasn't just the physical pain, it was the mental anguish they caused. Victims knew that the pain would only stop once they confessed or gave up the information they were being forced to reveal. The slow, steady tightening of the screws created a sense of helplessness. The victim could feel the inevitable destruction of their thumb, and often, the fear of permanent disfigurement would break their will. The victim's mind would race, trying to focus on anything but the throbbing pain, yet there was no escape. It was a grueling test of endurance, one that tested not just the body, but the will to resist. Unlike some other torture methods where death came quickly, thumbscrews could be prolonged for a long period of time, often until the victim had either confessed or been broken beyond recognition. The thumb, a small but vital part of the body, was incredibly susceptible to damage. The pressure from the device could crush the bones, dislocate the joints, and tear through the flesh, often causing lasting damage. In many cases, the victim would be left with deformed, unusable thumbs for the rest of their lives if they survived the ordeal. Thumbscrews were used primarily by inquisitors, military authorities, and sometimes even in courtrooms during the medieval period and the early modern era. Their relatively small size made them a practical tool for torture that could be used discreetly, yet still inflict intense pain on the victim. Though they were far less dramatic than the larger, more notorious devices like the Iron Maiden or the rack, thumbscrews were just as effective in obtaining confessions and subjugating those who were accused of crimes. The agony caused by the device often led to the victim confessing to crimes, whether real or imagined, just to end the excruciating pain. The effects of thumbscrews were not just physical, the psychological scars could last for a lifetime. Victims often found themselves unable to use their thumbs properly after the torture, and the damage to the nerves and bones was often irreparable. The lingering pain, coupled with the emotional trauma of the experience, left many victims unable to fully recover. The disfigurement of the thumb, once a symbol of manual skill and dexterity, became a permanent reminder of their humiliation and suffering. Though the use of thumbscrews faded with time, the memories of their torment live on. They stand as a testament to the cruelty of the medieval world, a world where the most painful forms of punishment were often reserved for those accused of heresy, treason, or other so-called crimes. The tiny device, small enough to be carried in a pocket, was capable of wreaking unimaginable agony and leaving victims scarred forever. A small, twisted hook designed to tear into the victim's skin with agonizing precision. Known as the cat's paw, this tool was used not just to extract pain, but to create lasting marks that would forever remind the victim of their torment. You're shackled to a cold, stone wall. The chill of the dungeon seeps deep into your bones. But the freezing air is nothing compared to the sweat beating on your forehead, the shivers of anticipation that run through your body. You hear the sound of footsteps approaching, slow, deliberate. Each step is a reminder of what's to come. Your body tenses, muscles locked in place. Fear tightens around your throat. Then, you hear the faint sound of metal scraping against stone, and your eyes fix on the device in the executioner's hand, the cat's paw. It looks small, almost deceptively simple, but you know that appearances can be deceiving. This tool is a harbinger of suffering. The device itself is small, yet it is one of the most cruel and efficient forms of torture ever devised. The cat's paw consists of a hook, typically made of iron, with a sharp, barbed edge designed to pierce the skin and tear through flesh. Unlike other tortures that used blunt force, the cat's paw was a tool that teared into the victim's skin with precision and intent. Its design made it perfect for ripping through muscle tissue, lacerating the skin in a way that was both immediate and agonizing. The pain from the cat's paw began with the sharp hook sinking into the flesh, tearing through layers of skin and muscle. When used, the torturer would often drive the hook into a vulnerable spot, the neck, the shoulders, or the flesh of the chest, and slowly twist it, tearing through the victim's body as they screamed in agony. However, the true horror of the cat's paw came from the added element of fire. The hook itself would often be heated in flames, making the pain exponentially worse. As it tore into the victim's skin, the scalding heat would burn the flesh, leaving behind searing wounds that festered in blood. It wasn't just the damage to the skin, it was the lingering burn, the smell of singed flesh, and the tormenting heat that made this form of torture so horrific. The victim would be left with deep burns, their skin scarred and bloody, often causing permanent disfigurement. The use of the cat's paw wasn't just physical, it was a form of psychological torture as well. The victim would not only suffer in the moment, but would also be left with the constant reminder of the trauma every time they looked at the scars left behind. The slow, painful process of being hooked and burned would wear down the mind, causing psychological distress and potentially leading to long-lasting mental scars. The victim would be left to question their own sanity as the pain seemed endless and unrelenting. The hook not only left physical wounds, but also a mental imprint of suffering that could last a lifetime. Unlike other forms of torture that killed quickly, the cat's paw was prolonged, leaving the victim alive, but permanently marked. The burns and lacerations left behind by the hook would often lead to infections or gangrene, further complicating the victim's suffering. The marks would be there to remind them of the pain they had endured, often disfiguring their bodies in a way that couldn't be hidden. The physical scars were not the only result of this torment. The emotional and psychological scars were often deeper, as victims were reminded daily of the fire, the hook, and the agony that had been forced upon them. The very image of their tortured body would serve as a testament to their humiliation and suffering. The cat's paw was used by various inquisitors and executioners across Europe during the medieval and early modern periods. It was a device that was not only used for punishment, but also as a tool to extract confessions, often used in the context of interrogations. The pain inflicted was intended to break the will of the victim. Much like other devices of the time, it was designed to make the victim suffer until they confessed to the crime they were accused of, whether they were guilty or not. The smallness of the tool made it easy to transport and use on the spot, making it a favored instrument of torture in more discreet situations. It could be used to intimidate, punish, and break down individuals, often in public displays meant to send a message of dominance and control. Though the cat's paw is no longer used in modern times, its history serves as a chilling reminder of how far human cruelty has been pushed in the name of power, control, and punishment. It stands as a symbol of the ability to break a person, both physically and mentally, leaving behind scars that may never heal. A public spectacle of humiliation, agony, and exposure. The pillory was not just a form of torture, it was a method of ensuring that the victim's shame and suffering were witnessed by all. A slow punishment that left a permanent mark, not just on the body, but on the soul. You stand in the center of a crowded town square. The murmur of voices fades into a distant hum as you are forced to kneel before the wooden contraption before you. The people around you watch, their eyes sharp and unforgiving. This is no ordinary punishment. This is a fate designed to humiliate, to expose, and to break you. The pillory awaits. The wooden boards creak as they are slowly positioned around your head and hands. The smell of sawdust fills the air as the device locks into place, securing your limbs, rendering you vulnerable to the world. You can't move, can't escape. All eyes are on you. The pillory was a device of exposure as much as it was a tool of torture. Its structure consisted of a tall wooden frame with several holes designed to hold the head, hands, and sometimes feet of the victim. The victim would be locked into the device in a kneeling or standing position, often for hours, sometimes days, subjecting them to public ridicule, physical pain, and mental torment. The holes in the pillory would be large enough to fit the victim's head and hands, but small enough to ensure that the victim was held tightly in place. Once the victim was positioned, they were trapped, unable to move, with no way of escaping the public exposure that came with their punishment. The pain of the pillory didn't come from the device itself as much as from the exposure and humiliation it caused. For the victim, the greatest torment wasn't the tightness of the hole or the rawness of their skin. It was the public nature of their punishment. Locked in place for all to see, victims were subject to the cruelty and mockery of the crowd. Often, townspeople would hurl rotten food, insults, or even stones at the victim, furthering their public degradation. The physical pain of being immobile, the stiffness in the neck and arms, combined with the overwhelming psychological toll, was designed to destroy any sense of dignity. While the pillory caused physical discomfort, its most lasting effect was the mental and emotional toll it took on its victims. The shame of being exposed to the world, unable to hide from the stares, the taunts, the gestures, it was a form of punishment that stripped the victim of all privacy and dignity. The victim would stand frozen as the entire community passed by. And in many cases, the punishment wasn't just about the physical toll, it was about breaking the spirit. Public humiliation was intended to leave a permanent mark on the person's life. Even after the physical effects wore off, the shame of being seen as a criminal by the community could last a lifetime, following the victim wherever they went. The pillory wasn't designed to kill. It was designed to make the victim suffer in a way that was meant to degrade and humiliate them before their peers. The pain from being immobile and in a kneeling position for long periods could lead to muscle cramps, joint pain, and sometimes circulatory problems. But the real suffering came from the mental and psychological effects of public ridicule. For days on end, the victim would be exposed to the cruelty of the crowd, enduring not just the physical discomfort, but the constant mocking, the degradation of their character, and the taunts that could break the toughest person's spirit. In some cases, victims were left in the pillory until they physically collapsed, unable to stand any longer, or until they were finally released by the authorities. The prolonged exposure to humiliation and the pain of being unable to defend themselves often made the pillory an ordeal that left long-lasting scars. The pillory was used across medieval and early modern Europe as a form of punishment for a variety of offenses, including theft, drunkenness, and public disorder. Its function was not only to punish, but to publicly shame the offender, serving as a reminder to others of the consequences of disobedience. While it might seem harmless compared to more brutal forms of torture, the pillory was a powerful tool in maintaining social control. By making an example of a victim, the authorities sought to deter others from committing crimes. The exposure itself was as much of a punishment as the physical discomfort it caused. Even after the victim was freed from the pillory, the emotional damage often lingered. The public nature of the punishment meant that the victim's crime would forever be tied to their name, their reputation tarnished. For many, the shame of having been publicly humiliated in front of their peers was worse than the physical pain they endured. The use of the pillory slowly declined over time as more humane forms of punishment gained popularity, but its legacy remains as a reminder of the power of public humiliation as a form of control and how deeply shame can affect the soul. A mask of humiliation and silence, designed to torment both the mind and the body. The Brank, or Scold's Bridle, was a medieval device used to enforce silence and punish nagging women. But it did more than just silence. The pain and mental anguish it caused were just the beginning of its horrors. You're forced to kneel on a cold stone floor, your vision blurred by the dim flicker of torchlight. The room is silent, save for the echo of your own heavy breathing. The sound of footsteps grows louder, and then you see it, the Brank, cold, unforgiving iron. A device meant to ensure silence, but the consequences of wearing it are much more than a mere lack of speech. The iron mask is brought down over your head, and you're forced to open your mouth. The device's spiked tongue presses into your mouth, forcing you into submission, while your face is distorted by the cruel, sharp edges that dig into your skin. You can barely move. Pain shoots through your jaw as the device locks in place, rendering you speechless and vulnerable. The Brank, often called the Scold's Bridle, was a punitive device made of iron, designed to silence those deemed troublesome or disobedient, particularly women. The device consisted of an iron cage that fit over the head, with a spiked metal gag placed inside the mouth. The tongue would be pushed down by the sharp spikes, causing immense pain with any attempt to speak. Unlike other devices, which might have been used to extract information, the Brank was specifically designed to punish those who were deemed scolds, women accused of being too talkative, gossipy, or disruptive. It was an instrument of silencing, both physically and mentally, as it ensured the victim could not speak without enduring excruciating pain. Once the Brank was placed on the victim's head, the iron cage would be locked securely into place. The metal gag was then positioned, forcing the victim's tongue down with sharp spikes that would press against the soft flesh, cutting into it as the victim struggled to breathe, let alone speak. The device was designed so that even the slightest movement or attempt at speech would cause intense pain. Victims were often left in public places to be displayed as a warning to others, their mouths forced open and their words silenced. The mental toll of wearing the Brank was immense, as the victim would endure the degradation of being paraded around while suffering both physical torment and the psychological effects of prolonged silence. The Brank was not just a tool of physical punishment, it was also a psychological weapon. The act of being silenced, of having your voice forcibly removed, was an act of complete control. This was especially true in a time when a woman's voice was often seen as disruptive or even sinful. The shame of wearing the Brank in public, exposed to the jeering eyes of the crowd, was enough to break a person. The pain from the spikes, the humiliation of being forced to remain silent, and the loneliness of being unable to express oneself could drive a person to the brink of madness. In many cases, the Brank would be worn for hours, sometimes days, until the victim could no longer endure the pain or the authorities decided that the punishment was sufficient. But the mental damage from being silenced in such a way could last far longer than any physical injury. The Brank often led to physical injury. The sharp spikes would cause cuts and abrasions on the tongue, cheeks, and the roof of the mouth, leading to infection and sometimes even blood loss. In more extreme cases, prolonged use could cause damage to the victim's teeth or jaw, permanently altering their appearance and speech. But the real lasting damage was psychological. The constant pain of the spikes, combined with the mental strain of being unable to speak, often led to insanity. Victims would become so consumed by the torment, the lack of voice, and the humiliation that many lost their sense of self, trapped in a world where their only identity was defined by their punishment. The Brank was predominantly used on women, often for offenses that were considered domestic or social, such as gossiping, arguing, or being too outspoken. It was used as a means of silencing women, enforcing the notion that their voices should be submissive and obedient. By forcing a woman to wear the Brank, authorities send a clear message: do not speak out, do not challenge, and do not be disruptive. It was a form of control that played on the notion that a woman's voice was both dangerous and undesirable, making the Brank one of the most dehumanizing devices used during its time. The Brank gradually faded out of use as societal views on women and punishment began to shift, but its legacy is a chilling reminder of the lengths people once went to in order to control others. The silencing of a person's voice is one of the most powerful forms of oppression, and the Brank did so with a cruelty that left deep psychological scars. Even after the device was no longer in use, the fear of being silenced in such a brutal way continued to echo through history, especially for women whose voices were seen as inconvenient, disruptive, or unruly. If these stories echoed in your sleep, help echo them further, like in Subscribe, a tool of savage torment designed to claw, tear, and shred the skin. The Spanish Tickler was a device of brutal precision, designed to leave victims gasping for mercy as their skin was ripped apart, one painful scrape at a time. You can feel the air grow cold as you're pushed into the dimly lit chamber. The Spanish Tickler hangs ominously on the wall, its claws glinting in the faint light of a flickering torch. It's not an instrument of quick death, it's far worse, slow, deliberate, and unyielding. Your hands shake as you're tied down, your body immobilized on the cold stone floor. The device is a long, curved set of metal claws, each one designed to tear through flesh with a sadistic precision. The torment doesn't end in a single blow. It's meant for repeated strikes, each one slowly shredding your skin, with every claw digging deeper into your tender flesh. You know what's coming, and the dread of it makes your heart race, your breath shallow. The Spanish Tickler was a torture device primarily used in the 16th and 17th centuries. Its purpose was not just to inflict pain, but to maim and disfigure. The design was simple, yet highly effective, a set of sharp metal claws attached to a handle, often resembling a rake. The claws were long and narrow, curved like animal talons, specifically designed to tear through skin, muscle, and tissue. The device's true horror came from its flexibility. It could be used with varying levels of force, from light scratches to deep, ripping gouges, depending on the torturer's intent. It was often employed for extended sessions, leaving victims writhing in agony as their skin was slowly pulled apart, one agonizing scrape at a time. When the Spanish Tickler was used, it was methodical, a slow, deliberate process meant to draw out maximum suffering. The victim would be strapped down, often on their back, as the torturer dragged the claws across their skin, starting with the arms, the chest, or the face. The claws would sink into the victim's flesh with a sickening sound, and as they were dragged across the body, pieces of skin would tear away, leaving bloody marks in their wake. Each scrape would cause blinding pain, and the victim would be left shuddering as the claws continued their work. It wasn't about death, it was about breaking the spirit, forcing the victim to endure unimaginable agony without the sweet relief of an end. The torment would continue for hours, sometimes days, until the victim's body could no longer withstand the strain. While the Spanish Tickler inflicted horrific physical damage, the psychological toll was just as devastating. The prolonged nature of the torture meant the victim would be forced to endure their suffering without any immediate end in sight. With each scrape, they would lose more of their humanity. The shredding of the skin was not just a physical wound, it was an assault on the soul, a cruel reminder that every moment of life brought only more pain. The victim's mind would begin to unravel. At first, the shock of the pain might make them fight against the restraints, but after hours or even days, the realization would set in. No escape. Every attempt to scream was met with further torment. Bleeding and weakened, the mind would begin to break, losing the will to fight. When the torture finally ended, Whether through death or mercy, the victim's body would be left in a state of horrific ruin. The claws of the Spanish tickler would have torn through layers of skin, leaving deep, jagged gashes across the body. Blood loss, infection, and scarring were inevitable, and many victims would die long before the torturer's work was done. The damage inflicted wasn't limited to just the surface. The claws would tear into muscle, tendons, and sometimes even bones, causing permanent physical disfigurement. But the most lasting effect was the psychological trauma. Even if the body healed, the victim's mind would be scarred forever by the terror of knowing they had been so vulnerable, left to endure such a prolonged and savage assault on their humanity. While the Spanish tickler was used as a form of torture, it wasn't reserved for just any criminal. It was often inflicted upon prisoners of war, heretics, witches, and enemies of the state. These individuals were already marked for punishment, but the Spanish tickler took the cruelty of their fate to a new level. The device was not meant to simply execute the victim. It was meant to break them, to punish them in a way that would leave them a lesson for all who witnessed. In some cases, the device would be used as a form of public spectacle. The victim, their body maimed and bloodied, would be paraded around as a warning. Their suffering would be a message, one that said, "This is what happens to those who defy us." Though the Spanish tickler eventually faded into the annals of history, it serves as a stark reminder of the brutal lengths to which humans would go to control and punish those deemed unworthy. Its design, though simple, speaks to the mind of a torturer who understood that pain could be prolonged, made personal, and inflicted in a way that would destroy both the body and the spirit. The Spanish tickler was not just a tool of torture, it was a device meant to reshape the victim, to tear away their identity and leave behind a shell of pain and suffering. The very name evokes a sense of terror, for to be touched by its claws was to be marked forever, not just on the skin but in the mind. A furnace of flesh designed to roast its victims alive. The brazen bull was an instrument of execution that trapped its prey inside a metallic cage, turning them into nothing more than a screaming sacrifice to its relentless heat. The chamber is eerily silent, the air thick with the stench of fear and sweat. As you approach the brazen bull, your eyes widen in horror at the sight of its massive, bronze form. This ancient device was not designed for quick death. It was designed for prolonged agony, for the kind of suffering that would linger long after the final breath was taken. You can hear the echoes of those who suffered within its infernal walls, those whose screams still haunt the stones of the chamber. The brazen bull was a terrifying invention of ancient Greece, allegedly devised by the tyrant Phalaris of Sicily in the 6th century BC. Its design was simple but horrifyingly effective. A hollow bull-shaped statue made of brass or bronze with a door to trap the victim inside. The unfortunate soul would be locked within the bull's stomach, and a fire would be lit beneath it, heating the metal to unbearable temperatures. The bull itself was crafted with such precision that its mouth acted as a funnel, channeling the victim's screams into a mechanical sound system. The metal would grow unbearably hot, and the victim would be roasted alive, their cries of agony distorted into inhuman shrieks, echoing through the contraption's design. Once inside the brazen bull, the victim would be immobilized, often bound or restrained to prevent any chance of escape, as the flames were stoked beneath the metal belly. The temperature inside the bull would rise to unimaginable levels. The heat would begin to slowly sear the victim's flesh, the air growing thick and oppressive, the scent of burning skin and muscle filling the chamber. As the heat intensified, the victim would begin to scream, but their cries would be transformed by the design of the bull. The funnel-shaped mouth amplified the sound, turning each scream into a bellowing echo that would resonate through the hollow belly of the beast. The design was ingenious. It not only ensured the victim's torment would be prolonged, but also served to mock their suffering by turning their pain into an eerie musical instrument of death. As the victim slowly cooked alive within the bull, the psychological toll would be devastating. The crushing confinement, the oppressive heat, and the constant screams of others before them would combine to create a sense of hopelessness. There would be no escape from the metal beast, no mercy from the flames. The victim would realize in the first moments that their end was inevitable. The idea of being cooked alive would shatter the mind each moment, a slow descent into madness as they roasted inside the bowl. The fear of fire, of heat, would twist into a primal terror as their flesh blistered, their skin bubbling under the intense heat. When the torturous process finally ended, the victim's body would be a charred and mangled mess. The intense heat would have burned the flesh off the bones, leaving only a hollowed-out shell behind. Even if the victim somehow survived for a moment after being removed, shock and burns would inevitably lead to death. The brazen bull left nothing of the victim but the ashes of a once living person. Even the bones would often be too fragile and cracked to identify after the metal's heat had finished its horrific work. The brazen bull wasn't just a tool for killing, it was a symbol of fear. It was a device meant to remind the people that under the rule of Phalaris and tyrants like him, disobedience would be met with the worst kind of death. It wasn't simply about the execution, it was about showing the people what could happen if they dared to question the authority. The bull was a terrifying message of control and power, a method of keeping the population in a state of constant dread. While the brazen bull fell out of use in the centuries following its creation, it left a legacy of horror that lingers to this day. Its chilling design has been recounted in history books, whispered about in legends, and even inspired portrayals in modern horror fiction. But its true horror lies not just in the suffering it caused, but in the fact that it represents a time when humans could create such monstrous inventions for the sole purpose of ensuring complete domination over another human being. The brazen bull serves as a reminder of the darkest depths of cruelty and the capacity of humans to subject others to unimaginable suffering for power, control, and terror. It is not just a story of death, but of the slow disintegration of the soul under the weight of tyranny. A seat of torment designed to break both the body and the spirit. The iron chair was not just a means of execution, it was a prolonged experience of suffering, where spikes and silence combined to stretch time into an eternity of agony. You stand in a cold, dimly lit chamber, and before you, the iron chair looms ominously. Its design is deceptively simple, a sturdy iron chair adorned with metal spikes jutting out from every angle. The air in the room is heavy with the lingering sense of death and pain, the echoes of past victims trapped in an endless cycle of torment. This is not a quick death. This is a slow, agonizing wait for the inevitable, a chair that doesn't just punish the body, but plays with the mind as well. The iron chair was an instrument of torture designed to induce the maximum amount of pain and humiliation. Its structure was deceptively straightforward, a large iron seat, often with a high backrest and armrests, and most horrifyingly, spikes embedded in the backrest, seat, and armrests. These spikes were positioned with careful precision to ensure that no matter how the victim moved, they would constantly be impaled. The victim was forced to sit in the chair for an extended period, often hours, and in some cases days. The spikes, although not immediately lethal, caused deep wounds that worsened over time, and the victim could not escape the continuous agony. The very act of shifting in the seat caused the metal to dig deeper into their flesh, intensifying the pain. Once bound to the iron chair, the victim was forced to remain perfectly still. The chair itself was a trap. There was no way to lean, adjust, or find any comfort. The spikes would slowly penetrate the body, tearing through flesh and muscle, while the constant pressure caused intense pain in the joints and limbs. Blood loss would eventually lead to dizziness, and the victim would lose the ability to focus on anything but the pain. As time passed, the mental anguish would begin to compound the physical suffering. Hunger, thirst, and the unbearable need to move became almost as excruciating as the spikes themselves. Victims of the iron chair were often left alone in a dark, quiet room, with only the sound of their breathing and the steady rhythm of their heartbeat to accompany them. The isolation became its own form of torture, a silent torment, where the mind itself slowly began to unravel. Perhaps the most torturous aspect of the iron chair was the mental suffering it caused. Victims were often left in isolation for long periods, sometimes days, with nothing but the steady rhythm of their heartbeats and the nagging presence of pain to keep them company. The room was silent, and the only sound to break the stillness was the occasional groan of the victim as they shifted in the chair. The silence, though, was not peaceful. It was a cloying silence that ate away at the victim's mind, making the hours feel like days. Time seemed to slow as the victim's body became a prison, every minute stretching into an eternity, every second a reminder of their helplessness. The spikes dug deeper with every movement, but it was the mental strain of the isolation that often led to the breaking point. Over the course of the iron chair torture, the victim would begin to suffer from extreme blood loss. The prolonged contact with the spikes would slowly rip open veins and arteries, causing a steady leak of blood. With no way to relieve the pressure, the victim's body would weaken, their strength slowly fading as they bled out. The only relief they would feel was when their body simply went numb from the pain, but even then, the sensation of the spikes never truly stopped. The pain of being stuck in the chair would become relentless, a constant reminder of the victim's helplessness. The mind would fracture as the body weakened, and the victim would eventually lose consciousness from shock, but this did not mark the end of their torment. The iron chair ensured that even in their final moments, they would be trapped within its grasp, suffering until the inevitable death would come. The iron chair was not just a tool of physical pain, it was a symbol of the cruelty of the tyrants who used it. It was used as a method of control, a way to break not just the body, but the spirit. It was a reminder that under the hands of those in power, no one was safe from the horror of being subjected to unimaginable suffering for simply crossing the wrong person. In history, the iron chair was employed by those who wanted to create a lasting memory of their dominance, turning their victims into a living warning to anyone who might challenge their rule. The mental anguish and physical damage inflicted by the device were meant to demonstrate not just the power of the tyrant, but the total helplessness of those caught in their grip. When the victim finally died, the iron chair was left behind as a testament to the brutality they had endured. The chair, now stained with blood, would be a silent reminder of the suffering it caused. The room would fall silent again, the echoes of the victim's final screams fading into nothingness. The iron chair would remain an enduring symbol of the darkest depths of human cruelty. It might have been discarded after its usefulness waned, but the mark of its horror would never truly leave. A chamber of death where the walls close in on their victim, sharp metal spikes piercing through skin and bone. The Iron Maiden is a name that echoes through history as one of the most terrifying instruments of execution ever created. But is it all just a myth? Or did the terror of this device truly exist? You stand at the entrance of a darkened, ancient chamber, your breath catching as your eyes fall upon the terrifying shape before you. The Iron Maiden, a tall and narrow structure made of steel, stands like an imposing figure in the center of the room. It resembles a human-shaped coffin, but its purpose is far more sinister. The walls are lined with razor-sharp spikes, each one waiting to impale the next victim foolish enough to be trapped inside. The Iron Maiden is often described as a human-shaped iron box, with a hinged door that opens to reveal a horrifying interior filled with sharp metal spikes. The spikes are arranged strategically, designed to impale the victim at key points on the body, such as the chest, throat, and abdomen, causing immense pain and damage. The victim would be forced to stand or kneel in the cage, unable to escape the torturous ordeal that awaited them. Despite its name, the Iron Maiden was not always the large, intricate device it is often depicted as. Many early examples were smaller, simpler devices, but they were still deadly. The spikes, which could range from small, thin needles to large, thick spikes, were designed not to immediately kill, but to cause prolonged suffering. Some versions were heated, adding a layer of intense pain, while others had spikes positioned to target vital organs, causing slow and agonizing death. The Iron Maiden is often considered one of the most iconic and terrifying torture devices in history. But historians argue that the device may not have been as widespread as popular culture suggests. Some believe that the Iron Maiden was a creation of later centuries, invented as a myth to amplify the horror of the Middle Ages. While there are historical records of similar devices, such as the Spanish Iron Maiden, which is believed to have been used in Sicily, the iconic Iron Maiden, as it is often depicted, was not used as extensively as we might think. Many historians point to the fact that the first Iron Maiden on record is often linked to 18th century Germany, and it was more of a novelty or a showpiece than a functional tool of torture. Despite the possibility that the Iron Maiden may have been exaggerated by storytellers, if it did exist, it was a tool of slow, agonizing death. A victim who was placed inside would be faced with a slow, painful demise. The spikes would pierce their skin, but not deeply enough to cause immediate death. The victim would be trapped in the device, unable to move or shift to alleviate the pain. The metal walls would trap them in a confined space, preventing any escape. As the victim struggled, the spikes would tear into their flesh, and the pain would become unbearable. The process would often last hours, with the victim slowly losing strength, unable to escape the unrelenting assault. Blood loss would eventually cause the victim to lose consciousness, but even that would be no mercy. They would wake in excruciating pain, unable to move from their position. Some versions of the Iron Maiden were designed with a mechanical trap. Once the victim was placed inside, the door would close with a swift clank, and the spikes would slowly push inward, guaranteeing that the victim was impaled in multiple areas of the body. In some cases, internal organs could be punctured, leading to death by blood loss or organ failure. What truly makes the Iron Maiden terrifying isn't just the physical pain inflicted upon its victims, but the psychological torment. The victim would be placed inside, completely exposed to the spikes, and their body would be slowly impaled as they waited for the inevitable. But the true horror lay in the waiting. The victim would likely face hours of torment, knowing that there was no escape, no relief from the spikes or the confinement. The fear of impalement was compounded by the knowledge that no one could come to their aid. The victim was left alone in a confined, dark space, surrounded by nothing but the cold, unyielding metal of the Iron Maiden. As the minutes stretched into hours, the victim's body would begin to shut down, and their mind would unravel. They would feel the cold, sharp metal against their skin, each movement resulting in agonizing pain, with no way to prevent it. The Iron Maiden became a symbol of brutality and tyranny. Whether it was used as a method of execution or simply a tool of intimidation, it represented the absolute power of the torturer over the victim. The device's psychological horror made it not just a tool of death, but a symbol of control, where suffering was inflicted for the sole purpose of demonstrating dominance over another human being. The Iron Maiden, whether myth or reality, still carries with it a heavy legacy. It is a reminder of the extreme cruelty that humans are capable of when they hold unchecked power over others. The device's presence in popular culture today only serves to remind us of the depths of human suffering and the dark history of torture. When the Iron Maiden was no longer needed, the victim's body would be removed, often mangled and unrecognizable, the blood staining the inside of the iron frame. But even in death, the victim's screams would linger in the minds of those who had witnessed the horror of their execution. The Iron Maiden might have been dismantled or left to rust, but the terror it instilled would remain long after the last breath was taken. A sharp, deadly device designed for a single purpose, to split bones and break spirits. The key splitter was not meant for prolonged agony. Its goal was much more terrifying. This device promised a swift, brutal end, meant for those who crossed the wrong person. You stand in a shadowy room, the air thick with suspended tension. A wooden rack rests against the wall, laced with ropes and jagged iron tools. One object in particular stands out, a gruesome instrument of execution that looks deceptively simple but hides a deadly purpose. The knee splitter, an ancient tool designed to break bones and cause instant agony, looks almost too straightforward to be as horrifying as its reputation suggests. At first glance, the knee splitter seems like a simple pair of metal blades, connected to a lever mechanism. Its purpose, however, is far from innocent. The victim's knee, the fragile joint of the lower leg, would be positioned in between the two sharp metal blades, which were placed in such a way that, once activated, they would squeeze inward, crushing the bones inside. The victim, often tied or held still by ropes, would have their leg bent at an unnatural angle, the knee joint placed directly in harm's way. The device worked by pressing the blades tightly against the thighs and the shin, ultimately focusing all of the pressure on the kneecap itself. With an excruciating crack, the bones would shatter under the force, causing instant pain and often irreparable damage. Unlike many of the more prolonged tortures of the era, the knee splitter was designed for quick execution. The agony was still there, of course. The bones would snap, the flesh would tear under pressure, and the victim would scream as their body was bent in unnatural ways. But the goal was speed, unlike the breaking wheel or the Iron Maiden, which sought to prolong the suffering as much as possible. The knee splitter aimed to get straight to the point, crushing bones, severing tendons, and delivering a swift end for the unlucky individual. The knee splitter could be used to disable the victim, ensuring that they could no longer run or escape, or it could serve as a means of torture, ensuring that death came quickly after the legs were rendered useless. Either way, the victim's fate was sealed. Either death came swiftly, or the person was left to suffer in agony with a crippled body. Unlike many of the more slow and methodical forms of medieval torture, the knee splitter was a tool often associated with swift justice. While it wasn't as well known as the rack or the Iron Maiden, it served a purpose in times when punishment needed to be severe and immediate. The knee splitter was often used on criminals, traitors, or enemies of the state, those who needed to be punished quickly and without mercy. While it wasn't necessarily designed to draw out suffering like other devices, it had a purpose: to break the person physically and to ensure that they would never walk again. The pain caused by the knee splitter was unimaginable. As the device was triggered, the pressure from the blades would be applied to the knee joint, starting as a tight squeeze. The bones would shatter, sending waves of pain through the leg. The ligaments and tendons would be torn apart as the joint collapsed under the pressure, and the flesh would be left bruised, torn, and shredded by the jagged metal. At the same time, the nervous system would overload from the sudden trauma, causing a sharp shock that would spread throughout the body. The victim would be paralyzed by pain, unable to move or escape, their body left crippled, broken, and unable to stand. For the unlucky few who didn't die immediately from the brutal snap of the knee, the shock alone could cause cardiac arrest, while others would succumb to blood loss, the crushing of blood vessels, or the destruction of the knee joint. But what made the knee splitter even more terrifying wasn't just the physical agony, it was the mental torment it inflicted. The victim would often be bound tightly, unable to escape the inevitable fate awaiting them. They could hear the mechanism of the knee splitter creaking and grinding, knowing that it was getting closer to their turn. There was no escaping the terror of the impending agony. Even if the victim could not understand the exact mechanics of the knee splitter, they would still know the result. The crushing of their body, the complete destruction of their ability to escape. The mental anguish would often precede the physical pain, as they would realize the helplessness of their situation. Once the knee splitter had done its work, the victim would be left to suffer. Those who didn't die immediately would be left in a crippled state, unable to stand or walk. They would be left with permanently shattered knees, their legs rendered utterly useless, their lives forever altered. In some cases, the victim would be left to die from the blood loss caused by the broken bones, or they would be discarded in a pit or prison cell to wait for their inevitable end. But in the worst cases, the victim's pain would not end with the crushing of their knee. It would become the start of an even darker fate, a slow, lingering agony until death finally took them. The knee splitter stands as a symbol of the speed and severity that medieval justice could bring. Though it wasn't as widely feared as some of the other torture devices, it still left its mark on those unfortunate enough to meet it. Its simple design, while brutal, ensured that death was swift and certain. While it didn't always guarantee a prolonged torment, its unforgiving nature left its victims with no hope of escape. The knee splitter, like so many devices of its time, was a symbol of an era where pain was quick, absolute, and merciless, and those who fell victim to it would find no mercy, just an unrelenting end. A tool designed for silence, its efficiency, and public spectacle, the garrote was the tool of choice for those who needed to eliminate their enemies with cold precision, leaving behind only a silent death. Used in the public squares of towns and cities, the garrote became a symbol of state-sanctioned terror, combining execution with a chilling display of power. In the dim light of a medieval town square, a crowd gathers, their murmurs blending with the wind. In the center stands the garrote, an unassuming device that seems too simple for such a final fate. It is a wooden frame, designed to hold the victim in place, with their neck firmly positioned in a tightening noose. The noose is threaded through a metal loop, operated by a screw mechanism. At first, it looks like a simple contraption, but once the victim is securely tied and positioned in place, the garrote's true purpose becomes clear. The screw is slowly turned, and the loop around the victim's neck tightens, applying pressure that will eventually crush the windpipe and the jugular veins, cutting off the flow of air and blood. Unlike other public executions, where the victim might scream thrash or beg for mercy, the garrote was designed to be quick, silent, and efficient. It didn't take long for the victim to lose consciousness. As the noose tightens, the victim would begin to feel the pressure on their throat, gradually making it harder to breathe. At first, there would be panic. The victim would struggle, pulling against the ropes and trying to fight for air. But the garrote's mechanism would not be kind. The screw would turn, and with each rotation, the noose would become tighter, compressing the victim's neck and cutting off the oxygen supply. The pain would be sharp, but quick, and the victim would soon lose consciousness, their body limp and broken by the tension. Unlike hanging, which could be a public spectacle of suffering, the garrote was a tool of efficient silence. It was used by those who wanted the deed done without drawing out the agony. The victim's struggle would last only moments, and soon they would be gone, their body left for the crowd to witness. The garrote wasn't just about execution, it was about public humiliation. In many cases, the condemned would be executed in the town square, where crowds could watch as the noose was tightened around their neck. These executions were a reminder to the public of the consequences of breaking the law, as well as the grip that the ruling powers had over the people. In some cases, political prisoners or heretics, those who went against the church or the state, were executed with the garrote as a way to send a message. The silence of the execution, as well as the quickness of the death, made it all the more terrifying. The people watching knew that the same fate could befall anyone who stepped out of line. What made the garrote so unsettling was not just the efficiency of the death, it was the psychological terror it inflicted on the condemned. As they were tied to the device and the noose was fastened around their neck, they knew what was coming. There would be no long struggle or final words, only a rapid suffocation. The victim's mind would race as they realized that there was no escape from their fate. The crowd would be watching, and there would be no chance for mercy. The garrote turned the act of execution into a psychological torment, as the victim knew that their end would be swift but complete, leaving them with little time for hope or redemption. For the rulers who used the garrote, the device represented power and control. Unlike the gruesome public displays of the breaking wheel or the Iron Maiden, the garrote was about efficiency and finality. It didn't drag out the suffering. It was quick, silent, and left no room for escape. It was used for those who were disloyal or who had been accused of crimes that threatened the stability of the state. Political dissidents, criminals, or anyone deemed unfit for society could find themselves at the mercy of the garrote, their fates sealed with a twist of the screw. In this way, the garrote became not just a tool of execution, but a symbol of the state's ability to carry out swift and unrelenting justice. It was an execution device that spoke of a time when power was brutal, silent, and absolute. The garrote didn't just disappear from history, it left its mark on the collective consciousness of those who lived during its time. For centuries, the silent and efficient nature of the garrote was remembered as a symbol of the unseen force of law. Though it was eventually replaced by more humane methods of execution, the garrote remained in the minds of many as a tool of terror. Its legacy endures as a reminder of the cold efficiency with which medieval justice could be carried out, swift, silent, and without mercy. And in the public squares of old cities, the garrote remains a chilling reminder of a time when life could be taken in an instant with nothing but a turn of the screw. A chilling symbol of the patriarchy's control over women's bodies, the ducking stool was used to punish and drown those accused of being witches. Its method was simple, yet terrifying. Submerge the victim into water until they were on the brink of death, all in the name of proving their guilt. The ducking stool was a device used during the height of witch hunts in the 16th and 17th centuries, designed to punish women accused of witchcraft. The apparatus was deceptively simple, consisting of a wooden chair affixed to a long beam. The victim, typically a woman, was strapped to the chair, their hands bound and their body fixed securely. The stool was mounted at the end of a lever, which allowed the accused to be dunked repeatedly into a body of water, often a river, pond, or lake. With every pull of the lever, the victim was plunged into the depths, struggling to breathe as they were submerged in the cold, suffocating water. Dunking was meant to prove the woman's guilt or innocence, but its true purpose was far darker. Accusations of witchcraft were based on superstition, fear, and the belief that women who stepped outside of societal norms were agents of evil. The ducking stool was often used as a form of interrogation, where the water symbolized the trial by ordeal. The idea was that if the woman was indeed a witch, she would survive the dunking because her body would be unnatural and resistant to the drowning process. The ritual of the ducking stool was cruel, both in purpose and practice. Victims would be dunked repeatedly, often for hours at a time, as the crowd jeered and watched in silence. The intent was not just to punish, but to humiliate and expose the victim's perceived moral failures to the public. For the accused, it was a constant battle for survival, a struggle for air, a fight against the cold shock of water filling their lungs. If the accused woman managed to survive the initial dunking, she might be pulled back up, gasping for breath. But the ducking stool would not stop there. The town's authorities would keep dunking her, each time pushing her further into the water, with the hope of breaking her will or confirming her guilt. The repeated submersions would cause hypothermia, near drowning, and exhaustion. For many, the ducking stool was a death sentence, as drowning could be the inevitable outcome. Even if the woman survived the ordeal, she was often left with severe trauma, bruises, and lasting psychological scars. The trauma could be so profound that the victim would live in fear for the rest of her life, haunted by the nightmare of drowning. The use of the ducking stool was deeply tied to the witch hunts of the period, where thousands of women were accused of witchcraft, a crime often tied to any sign of independence, rebellion, or even mental illness. Women could be accused of witchcraft for reasons as simple as being unmarried, having knowledge of herbal remedies, or even just acting strangely in the eyes of the community. In these cases, the ducking stool served as a form of punishment for a crime that was often invented to keep women under control. The trial by water was supposed to reveal the truth of a woman's innocence or guilt, but the odds were always stacked against the accused. Even if a woman survived, it was said to be a sign of her guilt, as she was believed to possess unnatural strength. Death by drowning was often seen as the only possible end for someone truly guilty. What made the ducking stool particularly terrifying was its role as a public spectacle. It wasn't enough to simply execute the accused, no. The community needed to witness the punishment, reinforcing the social order. Women were subjected to this public degradation in front of crowds who watched in morbid fascination as their neighbors were tortured. The humiliation was deepened by the very fact that the ducking stool was often used against women who were already marginalized. These women had little to no means of defending themselves against the accusations, and their entire community would often turn against them. The spectacle of the trial was as much about maintaining social order as it was about actual justice. By the late 17th century, the ducking stool began to fall out of use, largely because of growing skepticism about its effectiveness as a method of determining guilt or innocence. It became increasingly clear that the device was nothing more than a tool of torture, humiliation, and death, more for control than for justice. However, the ducking stool remains a dark reminder of the lengths to which society would go to suppress and punish those who were deemed unworthy of respect or freedom. Its legacy lives on in the witch hunts of the past, where women were forced to face not just death, but public humiliation and torment. Even today, the ducking stool serves as a haunting reminder of the brutal ways that society has historically treated women. The tool is not just a relic of a time when witch hunts were common, it is a symbol of the fear that often permeates society when women are perceived as threats. It speaks to the lengths that patriarchal systems have gone to suppress and control women, often by turning them into objects of fear and public spectacle. A terrifying combination of burning, binding, and public humiliation, the Wheel of Fire was a brutal method of execution designed not just to end lives, but to send a message through sheer horror. Those who faced the wheel did not simply die, they were made to suffer in front of the masses, their agony immortalized in public spectacle. The Wheel of Fire was a form of execution and torture used throughout medieval Europe, particularly during the 15th to 17th centuries. Unlike many torture devices that focused on the physical or psychological pain of the victim, the Wheel of Fire combined both flame and spectacle in a way that made it one of the most terrifying methods of punishment. The victim, often accused of heinous crimes, would be strapped to a large wooden wheel, typically a spoked wheel, secured tightly by ropes or chains. The wheel itself would be raised off the ground, elevating the victim into the open air, where they were exposed to both the elements and a crowd of spectators. But it wasn't just the wheel that made this form of punishment so dreadful. The real horror came from the fire. The victim would be set ablaze, often through the use of torches, flaming arrows, or even oil-soaked cloths placed directly on their body. The idea was to burn the victim slowly, torturing them for as long as possible before their inevitable death. The fire was a symbol of divine retribution meant to purify the victim's sins, or, in the eyes of the executioners, consume them entirely. What set the Wheel of Fire apart from other forms of execution was the spectacle it created. The execution was always public, often occurring in the town square or in front of crowds who eagerly awaited the show. This was not a quiet or private death. It was a performance, one that sent a message to the entire community about the consequences of breaking the law or defying the state. Before the burning, the victim would be placed on the wheel, with their body bound and exposed for the crowd to see. Spectators could witness the victim's suffering in real time as the fire slowly crept across their body. The flames would burn the skin, melt the flesh, and scorch the bones, all while the victim was still alive and writhing in agony. To increase the torture, the executioners would sometimes rotate the wheel, ensuring that the victim was continuously exposed to the flames from different angles. The rotation was intended to maximize pain and increase the suffering for as long as possible. It wasn't just about death. It was about prolonged suffering in full view of the public, a form of punishment that was both physical and psychological. The Wheel of Fire was not only an execution method, it was a tool of control and fear. During the era when witch hunts and brutal executions were rampant, authorities used public spectacles like the Wheel of Fire to intimidate the population. The more horrific and graphic the punishment, the more likely it was to instill fear in the general public, discouraging others from engaging in criminal behavior or defying the laws of the land. Crimes that could lead to the Wheel of Fire included everything from treason and murder to witchcraft and blasphemy. The accused were often victims of fear and superstition, with their suffering serving as a grim reminder of the power of the authorities. These executions were designed not only to punish the guilty, but also to entertain the public, transforming a death sentence into a morbid festival that was witnessed by crowds who would gather for the occasion. The real terror of the Wheel of Fire was in its psychological effects on the victim. The fear of burning alive in front of an eager, watching crowd was a special kind of horror. For the condemned, it was not just about the physical pain of being burned alive. It was about the fear of suffering in front of the masses. Knowing that the end was inevitable and that they would die publicly in the most agonizing way possible. The flames that consumed the victim were symbolic of purification in the eyes of the executioners, but for the victim, they were a horrifying reminder of their own powerlessness. The excruciating pain, the smell of burning flesh, and the sound of crackling bones created an atmosphere of terror that would haunt the witnesses for years to come. For the spectators, the horror was different. They would leave the scene with images burned into their minds, memories of a tortured soul writhing on a wheel, consumed by fire. It was a brutal reminder of the power of the authorities, the futility of resistance, and the precariousness of life in a time where death could come for the smallest infraction. Over time, the Wheel of Fire became less common, eventually falling out of favor in many regions as more human methods of execution began to replace older, more brutal practices. By the 18th century, the public execution of criminals became less of a spectacle and more of a private affair. The wheel itself would eventually be retired from service, its flames extinguished by changing social attitudes and advocacy for human rights. However, the Wheel of Fire remains a powerful symbol of a time when life was cheap, when pain was inflicted not just as punishment, but as a tool for terror and control. It serves as a haunting reminder of the lengths to which societies would go to maintain order, and the suffering that innocent and guilty alike endured under the hands of power. A device that combined the most excruciating physical torment with a brutal display of public humiliation. The wooden horse was a medieval instrument of torture designed to break both the body and the spirit. For those who sat upon it, there was no escape from the agony that would splinter the soul as much as the body. The wooden horse, or equus, was a device of torture infamous for its excruciating ability to render the victim both physically immobilized and mentally broken. Unlike many other devices used in medieval torture, the wooden horse wasn't meant to maim the body in a traditional sense, but rather to force the body into unnatural positions, creating intense pressure on the sensitive regions of the body. The device was essentially a large wooden beam, shaped like a horse, often fashioned to resemble a horse's back or a narrow triangular bench. The victim would be made to straddle the sharp, angled structure, sitting awkwardly with their legs forced apart. The beam would be positioned in such a way that the weight of the body rested upon the victim's groin area. The pain, however, was only part of the torture. As the victim was forced to sit on the narrow beam, the pressure would force them into a position of instability, where any slight movement could result in further discomfort or even permanent damage to their most delicate body parts. What made the wooden horse so particularly heinous wasn't just the pain it caused immediately, but the fact that the victim could be left in that agonizing position for hours, even days. The victim was often bound to the device, leaving them no opportunity to move or escape the relentless pressure and pain. As the victim was left sitting on the splintered wood, they would be forced to endure constant discomfort as their body weight bore down on the sharp, unyielding surface. Over time, the pain would intensify, and the victim would suffer from intense bruising, internal bleeding, and sometimes damage to the groin or pelvis. The lack of movement would result in severe muscle cramps, numbness, and a constant feeling of helplessness as the body became stiff from the inability to adjust. But the physical suffering was compounded by the psychological torment. Being placed in such a vulnerable position, exposed to the eyes of spectators, if it was a public torture, would leave the victim utterly humiliated. There was nowhere to hide, no escape from the shame of their position and the screams of agony that were bound to escape their lips as they endured the prolonged torture. The wooden horse wasn't merely a physical instrument of pain. It was also a psychological weapon. The sensation of being forced to sit for hours, sometimes days, on a splintering and agonizing beam would have a profound effect on the victim's mind. It wasn't just the physical pain of being impaled, it was the mental strain of feeling utterly powerless and unable to do anything to stop it. The victim would often be left to contemplate their impending fate, all while being subjected to the humiliation of their position. The sheer helplessness of being trapped on the device, unable to move or escape, could break even the strongest will. The prolonged suffering could eventually lead to mental breakdowns, delirium, or even death from the shock or extreme pain. Many victims of this torture would beg for mercy, but the torment often continued until the authorities decided that the victim had suffered enough or that their confession had been extracted. The wooden horse was designed to break the body and the mind, leaving behind a shell of a person, stripped of their dignity and humanity. The wooden horse was used primarily for punishing those accused of crimes that were considered particularly heinous, often involving moral or sexual transgressions. In the medieval period, accusations of adultery, witchcraft, or blasphemy could all lead to a victim being subjected to this torturous device. The victim's punishment would not only be about retribution, but about sending a message to the public, reminding them of the price of defying the church or the state. Those who were victims of this torture were often subjected to public ridicule. It was not unusual for the torture to be carried out in public squares or in front of a crowd of spectators, where people would come to watch the suffering of the accused. The wooden horse would be a spectacle, a brutal reminder of the cost of disobedience, sin, or rebellion. As time went on, public executions and tortures became less common, and by the 18th century, the wooden horse had largely fallen out of use. The introduction of more humane methods of punishment and growing public sentiment against cruelty contributed to its decline. However, the legacy of the wooden horse remains a stark reminder of the brutality of medieval punishment and the lengths to which societies went to maintain control over their populations. Though the device was retired, its impact was deeply ingrained in the collective memory of the time, and stories of its horrific effects still linger in historical records, testifying to its place in the annals of human cruelty. More than a tool of physical restraint, the collar of shame was a psychological weapon, designed not only to control the body, but to break the spirit. It was a device meant to leave scars on the soul, trapping the victim in a cycle of public humiliation and prolonged suffering, their every moment marked by the cruel reminder of their fate. The collar of shame, also known as a neck collar or Scold's Bridle, was a medieval device used to publicly punish those who had committed what were considered moral or social crimes. Unlike other physical torture devices, its purpose was more psychological. Its primary goal was to humiliate and subjugate the victim by publicly marking them as someone who had done something wrong in the eyes of society. The collar was typically made of iron, with a heavy, rigid structure designed to encircle the neck. It was locked into place, making it impossible to remove, often with sharp metal prongs that dug into the victim's skin to ensure that no matter how much they struggled, the collar would stay firmly in place. A distinguishing feature of the collar was its open design, which allowed the head to be exposed while keeping the victim immobile. This was the perfect combination for public humiliation. The person wearing the collar was forced to stand before a crowd, their shame made visible for all to witness. Once the collar of shame was affixed, the victim would often be paraded through the streets, forced to endure the jeers, taunts, and laughter of passers-by. Depending on the crime, the accused might be made to wear the collar for days, weeks, or even longer. This device ensured that the individual was never allowed to escape the mocking gaze of the public, making their punishment not just about physical pain, but also about psychological trauma. The purpose was clear: control the body, but more importantly, break the spirit. Being forced to stand in public, humiliated and exposed, was a fate worse than death for many. Wives accused of gossiping, women accused of being witches, drunkards, and even minor criminals were all subjected to this form of punishment. The more severe the offense, the longer the public exposure, adding even more to the psychological toll. What set the collar of shame apart from other forms of punishment was its ability to induce a profound sense of degradation in the victim. It wasn't just the discomfort of wearing the collar, it was the knowledge that you were being treated like an object of mockery in front of your entire community. The collar's tight grip on the neck, sometimes causing painful abrasions or bruising, was a reminder that the victim was public property. Their very breathing was restricted, and they were incapable of turning their head without discomfort. The constant weight of the collar acted as a psychological anchor, reminding them of their transgression at all times. Staring ahead, they were forced to endure the looks of scorn from those they had once known. This kind of punishment was intentionally designed to strip away dignity, a psychological horror far worse than the physical pain. It worked on the principle that humiliation was a tool more effective than physical violence in some ways. Guilt, shame, and self-loathing became internalized as victims learned to hate themselves for having been subjected to such degradation. Over time, the victim would often lose any sense of self-worth. The collar of shame was so effective because it reinforced social isolation. As the victim was forced to endure their punishment, they often found themselves completely alienated from their community. Even if they survived the collar's physical effects, the social ostracization could remain with them for the rest of their lives. Many victims would suffer from depression, anxiety, or complete mental collapse as the unrelenting shame wore away at their mental state. For women in particular, the collar of shame was often applied in cases of accusations of witchcraft or social misconduct. In these instances, the victim's reputation was often irreparably damaged, and they were often treated as outcasts, regardless of whether they had committed any actual wrongdoing. Once the victim was released from the collar of shame, they often found themselves irreparably damaged, not by physical scars, but by the psychological wounds that would never fully heal. Even if the collar was removed after a few days, the memory of being publicly humiliated in such a manner could haunt them for the rest of their lives. This punishment was designed to leave a lasting mark on both the individual and the community. Those who wore the collar were forever branded by the experience. The shame they endured made it nearly impossible for them to reintegrate back into society as they had been before. Social stigma followed them, and many victims found themselves cast aside, their future forever overshadowed by their punishment. As the centuries progressed, the collar of shame faded from use. However, its legacy as a psychological torture tool persisted in the annals of history. Though it was no longer in practice, its method of inflicting emotional pain through public exposure remained a poignant reminder of the power of shame. Today, the collar of shame remains a symbol of a dark chapter in history where humiliation was used as a tool of control and subjugation. The idea that psychological punishment could be as effective, if not more so, than physical torture shows just how deeply humans can be hurt by their own minds. In a time where loyalty to the crown was absolute, speaking out was a dangerous act. The tongue tirer, a gruesome instrument of punishment, was reserved for those who dared to voice their dissent. More than a simple execution tool, it was a symbol of silencing, designed not just to punish the body, but to sever the voice of rebellion forever. The tongue tirer was a particularly barbaric device used to punish those who spoke against the crown, the state, or the established order. It was designed for public humiliation and to serve as a chilling reminder that free speech could come at a horrifying cost. The device itself looked like a pair of iron pincers, large and capable of clamping onto a person's tongue with savage force. The pincers were designed with sharp teeth on the inside, able to tear into the sensitive flesh of the tongue, causing unbearable pain. Once the victim's tongue was captured, the device would either rip it out entirely or sever it in pieces, ensuring that the person would be unable to speak again. In many monarchies where the crown's word was law, speaking out against the government or the ruler was a crime of treason. The tongue tirer was often used on individuals who spoke out publicly against the king or queen, or those who were found guilty of inciting rebellion with their words. But it wasn't limited to treason, it was also applied to those who slandered or defamed important figures, including church leaders and local lords. The punishment was deliberate, not just to punish the body, but to destroy the ability to continue spreading dissent. When the victim's tongue was severed, it was final. The loss of speech meant that the accused would never again pose a threat through their words. For many, this punishment marked the end of not just their rebellion, but of their voice in the world. It was final in a way that few other forms of torture could be. Like many other forms of medieval torture, the execution of the tongue tirer was often carried out in public, a spectacle meant to send a message to anyone considering questioning authority. The victim would be placed in a public square or in front of a crowd of onlookers, a stark reminder that the king's justice would be swift and absolute. As the iron pincers were forced onto the tongue, there was no escape for the victim. The pain was indescribable, as the iron teeth would tear through the delicate tissue of the tongue, a sensitive organ designed for speech. Victims often screamed in agony, but their cries were muffled by the grip of the device, turning their very voice into a tool of their own punishment. The tongue tirer wasn't just about physical pain. It was about silencing the person in a way that rendered them voiceless and powerless. For someone who relied on their ability to speak, whether for pleading their case, defending themselves, or even proclaiming their innocence, the punishment was particularly cruel. The loss of speech was more than just an injury. It was a complete eradication of the person's ability to engage with the world around them. In some cases, the severing of the tongue was done in such a way that the victim was left mutilated, unable to even eat or drink without assistance. The psychological toll was immense, as the individual not only lost their voice, but became a living example of the consequences of speaking out. Even after the tongue tirer had done its work, the victim would often face a lifetime of suffering. Some victims survived the procedure, but they would never be able to speak again. Their lives became a constant reminder of fear, a fear of speaking that could infect not just the person, but also those who witnessed the horror. In some ways, the act of silencing someone was more permanent than death itself because it left them a ghost trapped within their own body, unable to communicate. In a society where speaking out could result in such a severe punishment, the reputation of the victim was often ruined beyond repair. The act of speaking against the crown, whether for justice or truth, was viewed as a treasonous act, and no one would ever view the victim the same way again. They had been marked as outlaws, even in their silence. By the end of the Middle Ages, the use of the tongue tirer began to fade. With the rise of more sophisticated legal systems and human rights, The practice of mutilation as a form of punishment became less acceptable. Yet, the legacy of the tong-tir remains as a chilling symbol of the lengths to which authorities would go to ensure the silencing of dissent. Though the device has long since disappeared, the psychological fear it instilled continues to reverberate through history. It serves as a reminder that, at its core, the power of speech has always been both a weapon and a tool that can either uplift or destroy. And for those who dared to speak against the crown, the tong-tir was the ultimate price. In the quest for information, no method was too cruel. The chair of nails, one of the most brutal interrogation devices of the Middle Ages, was designed not just to extract confessions, but to break the spirit of its victims. The chair was a tool of psychological and physical torture, turning its unfortunate occupant into a human pincushion. The chair of nails, as its name suggests, was a chair lined with sharp, iron spikes. These nails were driven into the seat, backrest, and even the armrests, creating a horrific seat of agony. The chair's design was simple yet effective. It was crafted with the sole purpose of inflicting maximum pain while keeping the victim immobile for extended periods of time. Some versions were equipped with spikes beneath the seat to pierce the lower body, while others featured sharp nails on the backrest to cause severe upper body discomfort. In some instances, the nails were positioned at such an angle that the victim's flesh was impaled, forcing them to remain seated in an agonizing position, unable to move without further injury. The chair of nails wasn't designed simply for torture, it was a tool for interrogation. In a time where the extraction of confessions was paramount, this device was considered a highly effective way to break the victim's will. Whether the accused was guilty or not, the chair was intended to wear down their mental resolve and extract the desired information through sheer pain and discomfort. The victim would be strapped into the chair, unable to move, with the sharp nails digging into their skin. The longer they sat in it, the more their body would succumb to the pressure of the nails, causing unbearable pain that would force them to confess to almost anything in order to end the torment. The fear of the chair was not just from its pain, but also from the inevitability of how long it would last. The chair of nails wasn't just about the physical suffering, it was also about the psychological torment it caused. Sitting in the chair, the victim knew that the longer they resisted, the longer they would be forced to endure the agonizing experience. The nails would dig deeper with each slight movement, and as time passed, the victim's mental state began to deteriorate. The chair also humiliated its occupants, putting them in a vulnerable position while they were subjected to interrogation. This device was often used to extract confessions from those accused of treason, heresy, or witchcraft, and the fear of the chair spread quickly through communities, ensuring that silent compliance was preferred over the agony of being forced into one. Once strapped into the chair of nails, the victim was often left there for hours, sometimes even days, as part of the torture process. The intention was to create an excruciating waiting game where every second felt like an eternity. The victim would sink deeper into despair, knowing that every movement could cause the spikes to puncture deeper into their flesh, making the pain even more unbearable. In many cases, interrogators would use the chair to break the victim's resolve. Psychological manipulation was just as important as the physical torment. If the person refused to confess, the torment would go on, each minute serving to wear down the spirit. If the victim did speak, they were often forced to confess to things they had never committed, just to end the suffering. The physical effects of sitting in the chair of nails could be long-lasting. Victims would suffer from severe infection, nerve damage, and tissue destruction from the prolonged exposure to the spikes. Many would lose the use of their limbs due to the extended period of immobility and the damage done by the nails. For some, the damage was so severe that they would never fully recover. The psychological damage was just as lasting, being forced into such a humiliating position, where one's body was vulnerable to the point of agony, often led to a lifetime of trauma. Those who survived the chair would never forget the experience, and the fear of being strapped into it again lingered for the rest of their lives. Though the chair of nails fell out of use by the end of the Middle Ages, its legacy as a symbol of torture and intimidation lived on. Today, the chair is often remembered as one of the most terrifying methods used to extract confessions and force compliance. Its effectiveness lies not just in its pain, but in its ability to keep the victim in a constant state of dread, a dread that would break even the strongest of wills. The chair of nails serves as a grim reminder of how powerful fear can be as a tool of control. To know that a device like this existed and was once used to dominate a person's every movement is enough to make anyone fear the weight of authority. You're tied down in a boat, your limbs stiff, your skin coated in milk and honey. Not to soothe, but to attract, you feel them crawling first, then biting, then burrowing. You scream, but the marsh swallows your voice. There is no end to this death, just a slow digestion of you. Scaphism is the kind of horror that doesn't need exaggeration. There's no need to invent monsters when history had methods like this. No need to embellish when men were buried alive, with their stomachs exposed, and their flesh offered to the swamp like meat at a feast. Scaphism, also known as the boats, was more than execution, it was erosion. A method so slow, so precise, and so unimaginably revolting, it became legend. But this was no story. It was a Persian punishment, carefully documented. A process of turning the human body into an ecosystem of suffering. A living banquet for every insect, parasite, and microbe the marsh could provide. The word Scaphism comes from the Greek skeisa, meaning boat. But this was no ride across water. It was death by entrapment. 2 shallow boats, or sometimes hollowed-out tree trunks, were laid on top of one another. The condemned was stripped naked and laid inside, their limbs forced through holes so that their arms, legs, and head were completely exposed. Then the top boat was closed over them, leaving the body stretched, swollen, and completely immobile, like an insect pinned beneath glass. But the restraint was only step 1. The real horror had yet to begin. The executioners began feeding the prisoner, not once, not twice, but repeatedly for days. They poured warm milk and honey into their mouth, forcing it down even when they gagged. If the prisoner refused, they pried their mouth open with metal hooks and kept pouring. This wasn't mercy, it was a trap, because the rich sugar and lactose flooded the body, triggering violent diarrhea. But the victim couldn't move. They defecated where they lay, within the narrow, tight shell of the boat, so that feces, urine, vomit, sweat, and milk pooled beneath and around them. And then came the second coating. Milk and honey were smeared onto the victim's skin, generously across the face, chest, genitals, thighs. In the summer sun, it turned sticky, then sour, then ripe. Every fly within miles could smell it. They came in waves, flies first, then mosquitoes, then gnats, hornets, beetles. And they didn't just bite, they laid eggs, inside the skin, inside open sores, inside the warm, waste-filled spaces where the body began to rot before it died. In time, maggots formed, hatched and multiplied. They burrowed under the skin, crawled into the eyes, the nose, the genitals. In a few days, the flesh became unrecognizable, swollen, dark, wet. The body was still alive, but no longer human. The most infamous account of Scaphism comes from Plutarch, the Greek philosopher and historian. He describes a soldier named Mithridates, condemned in the 5th century BCE by King Artaxerxes of Persia for insulting the crown. Mithridates wasn't executed for treason. He was punished for pride. According to the record, he was placed in the boats, fed and coated with milk and honey, left upon the stagnant waters of the marsh. The sentence was not days, it was until death, and it took him 17 days to die. Every day more insects came. Every night, the swelling worsened. His body rotted from within. Eventually, worms began to eat the lungs and intestines through open wounds in the abdomen. The smell was so profound that birds refused to land nearby. When he finally died, the flesh was sloughing off the bone, yet his eyes had remained open until the last morning. He was awake, aware, digested, piece by piece, by a swamp. Scaphism is horrifying because it weaponized biology. It didn't rely on blades, fire, or blunt trauma. It relied on nature's cleanup crew. Here's what made it so effective. Forced feeding prevented starvation, but ensured internal decay. Diarrhea and urine soaked the body, creating the perfect environment for bacteria. Sugars from milk and honey accelerated microbial growth and attracted insects. Still water beneath the boat kept the air humid and warm. Insects laid larvae which fed on the softest flesh, eyes, lips, groin, anus. Essentially, the victim became a living corpse, slowly eaten alive by thousands of small mouths. And because they were kept hydrated and fed, they didn't die quickly. Some survived over 2 weeks, trapped inside their own decomposition. Physical pain is one thing, but Scaphism inflicted something deeper: madness. Imagine feeling your skin blister and bubble in the sun, hearing the buzz of wings that never go away, knowing what's inside you moving, chewing, growing, and still being alive. Many victims begged for death within the first day, but the structure of the boats made suicide impossible. Some went blind from infection. Others lost the ability to speak as their throats swelled with inflammation. But most remained conscious far longer than anyone should. Scaphism wasn't for petty theft. It wasn't even common. It was reserved for the worst, or at least those considered worst by the regime. Traitors, assassins, blasphemers, rebels who mocked the king. Men who thought themselves too clever for their masters. And while the accounts are few, they are horrifyingly consistent. Enough that historians believe Scaphism was real, though likely rare due to its complexity and spectacle. This wasn't private punishment, it was a show. Victims were often placed in the center of towns or on floating rafts in public marshes as warnings. People would walk by. Some laughed, some prayed, and others turned away, vomiting, because Scaphism didn't just kill the body, it destroyed the idea of rebellion. Near the end, the body no longer resembles a person. The face is swollen shut, the limbs black with rot, the stomach bloated from gas and fluid, and underneath, inside the hollow boats, is a stew of human decay, a bubbling mixture of waste, blood, and insects feeding at every layer. Some say the final hours were marked by quiet, not screaming, not thrashing, just soft gasps, a wheeze. The last breath of someone who has been forgotten, left to the elements. Then the body slumps, the insects continue, and the executioners break open the top boat. What remains is collected with long hooks, and the boats are washed. For the next one, you're not laid down. You're not restrained by ropes. You're not even injured at first. Instead, they place you in a cage just big enough to hold your body upright. You can't sit. You can't rest. You can't breathe deeply. The birds come before the flies, and you remain there suspended between death and disgrace. Imagine being trapped inside yourself, not just physically, but mentally, unable to move, unable to sleep, unable to do anything but wait for death. That's what coffin torture was designed for, not just to punish, but to unravel a person. It was one of the cruelest, most psychologically devastating tortures of the medieval world, and perhaps the most humiliating. Not just a tool of death, but of spectacle, a public display of shame, suffering, and the slow disintegration of a soul. The term coffin torture doesn't refer to a coffin you might picture from a funeral. There was no padding, no lid, no piece. It was also called the iron cage, the gibbet, or in some cases, the crow's cage, and it was often made of iron bars, reinforced wood, shackles with spiked interiors, or even wrought steel formed to the human outline. The design was grotesquely precise. It matched the outline of a human body exactly, but always just a little too small. There was no room to bend your knees, no space to lower your arms, no freedom for your head to rest. You were locked in upright or semi-hunched with no support, no cushion, and no escape. A human turned into a living statue, suspended, visible, and utterly helpless. The coffin torture wasn't meant to kill quickly. In fact, in most cases, death wasn't the goal, suffering was. It was administered as both punishment and warning. The condemned would be stripped naked, or partially clothed for humiliation, and locked into the cage. They were then either hung from a post elevated for all to see, or suspended from trees, walls, or the sides of castles, or left standing in open fields exposed to sun, wind, and animals. And from that moment on, time began to unravel them. Day 1. Your legs tremble from holding you upright. Your arms go numb. You can't shift your weight. Day 2. The blood pools in your feet. Your joints begin to swell. Your skin burns in the sun. Day 3. You haven't slept. Your lips crack. Your mouth dries. You hallucinate. Day 4. They start to arrive. Unlike some tortures that took place in secret, coffin torture was proudly public. That meant animals came, drawn by smell, by movement, by helplessness. Birds were often the first. Crows would land on your shoulders, waiting for the inevitable stillness of death. Ravens sometimes pecked before the body was cold, going for the eyes. Vultures in hotter climates would circle above, knowing the end was near. If the cage was hung near a gallows or execution site, the stench of rot brought them faster. And if the prisoner remained alive, barely, they would be forced to watch the pecking begin. Sometimes it wasn't birds, it was rats, dogs, even insects crawling through wounds, laying eggs in open sores. The victim became a vertical banquet, eaten in real time, often while still breathing. One of the most chilling aspects of coffin torture is this. Sometimes they let you live. The punishment could last a day or two, or until the edge of death, then you'd be released. But survival wasn't mercy. It was transformation. The survivors were broken, their muscles atrophied, their minds fractured. Some came out with permanent nerve damage, unable to walk. Others never spoke again, their minds caught in a loop of confinement. And some begged to be put back in. Not because they wanted to die, but because they no longer knew how to exist outside it. Coffin torture was not just for murderers. It was often reserved for moral crimes, at least in the eyes of the church or the crown. Blasphemy, heresy, adultery, witchcraft, public drunkenness in some towns, theft of sacred items, speaking against the church. That meant everyday people, not warriors or rebels, could be subjected to this. And because it was public, it was also a tool of shame. Children were made to watch, villagers encouraged to throw rotten food. Some victims were mocked, others were spat on, beaten while caged, or burned with torches. It was a punishment of isolation inside attention. You were both forgotten and unforgettable. There are medieval records of victims surviving up to 9 days in a cage. Some were kept alive intentionally. Guards would bring bread and water, not enough to nourish, but just enough to prolong. Others were left to rot until their bones slipped through the bars, picked clean by crows. One 13th century French execution record reads, "He wept not for death, but for sun. It scalded his eyes so they burst, and the ravens found him blind and without fight." Another from Germany mentions a cage maiden, accused of sleeping with a priest, who was left in her coffin cage for 5 days until she begged for a rope to hang herself with. When she died, they left her there another 5, until her body split open from heat and bloat. While coffin torture, as a term, is most often associated with medieval Europe, the concept existed globally, under different names and forms. In China, iron cages were used during the Qing dynasty, sometimes hung from city gates. In Japan, samurai law included cage punishments for dishonored warriors. In Scotland, accused witches were locked in body cages and suspended over rivers. In America, early settlers used punishment cages for religious crimes, especially among Puritan groups. In all cases, the elements were the true executioners: wind, rain, sun, snow, and time. Coffin torture didn't die with the medieval period. In some regions, it evolved. During the 18th century, pirates were often gibbeted, hung in iron cages after death or near death, and displayed at harbor entrances as warnings. During colonial rule, British forces in parts of India used cage executions for rebels. And in 1930s Soviet labor camps, makeshift punishment cages were used in gulags, no longer visible to crowds, but just as cruel. Even today, in the darkest corners of war zones and cartel territory, similar methods appear: metal boxes, solitary confinement with no light, upright restraints. coffin torture never truly vanished. It just changed names. There's something uniquely terrifying about the idea of dying on your feet. Your legs buckling. Your breath shallow. The world spinning. But you're upright. Suspended. You don't fall. You just sag. Your body grows heavier. Your knees bend slightly. Your head slumps forward. And the cage holds it all, every twitch, every final breath, every last rattle of bone on iron. Then it's silent. But the birds aren't done. Comment your favorite or most feared method.